countries. I just wanted to acknowledge a number of people from whom I've taken some slides. Key among them, Poverty Action Lab at MIT, but also Nava Ashraf, Rachel Glenister, and Lakahala Scott Lee and Sam Asher helped with these slides. There's been a resurgence of field research in developing countries in the past 15 years. Many of you will be familiar with some papers in this area. You can think of Esther Duflo's work on women as policymakers. You can think of the Progressa work on conditional cash transfers, which started in Mexico, but through randomized evaluation, we're able to quite definitively establish the impact of this program. And as a result, it was adopted, broadened in Mexico and adopted in 30-some other countries. There's been work that has had a big influence on questions that were very difficult to get at, and of a lot of theoretical interest, like Carlin and Zinman's work on moral hazard versus adverse selection. There's the series of papers on creditor shareholder protection around the world, also based on primary data and on regulation, other things. So this work has had a lot of impact. This talk is really designed to provide some practical sort of how-to tips on how to do this. And there's in the morning, I'm going to talk about field research in developing countries, things like survey design, a bunch of sort of very nuts and bolts issues like that. In the afternoon, I'm going to focus on randomized evaluations in developing countries. So obviously, when you're doing a randomized evaluation, you also have to worry about survey design. So the first set of issues will be applicable to randomized evaluations as well, but also applicable to studies like to things like Andre Schleifer's work or Chris Udry's work, which is not using that technique typically. Okay. So let me start off with the question. So some of you are already committed to this field, but some of you haven't yet drunk the Kool-Aid. So let me sort of talk about the pluses and minuses of conducting field work and development, and then go through some practical issues on survey design. I'll focus on, there's obviously questions for measurement for a whole bunch of different areas. Some issues come up when you're looking at consumption or profits of small businesses in developing countries, which have very different types of record keeping than businesses in developed countries. Talk about attrition issues. There are a bunch of 7, 8, and 9 are a bunch of practical issues. I may move them up depending on how timing is going. And then talk about some recent work suggesting that the act of measurement may in fact affect behavior, which this is the mere measurement effects, which is of concern for a lot of empirical work. Okay. So, whether to do field work in development, well, there's two questions. First, whether to work on development. As a development economist, I guess I'm biased on this one. But one reason to work on development is that's where most people in the world are, roughly 80% of people. There's also the problems are particularly important. If you think that if you've got a log utility, log utility, then the value of a little bit more consumption in the developing world is going to be very high. But at the same time, there's much less research in the developing world. And here's a quote, some statistics from a paper by Dosto, Shanes, and Srinivasan. So just hugely more papers on rich countries than poor countries. Turns out, by the way, the U.S. may not be that much of an outlier. This may just be largely explained by a straight GDP relationship. But poor countries have a lot less research on them. Okay. Now, another reason, aside from the importance of the problems and the relative scarcity of research, is that there's some opportunities to do things in developing countries that might be difficult or more expensive elsewhere. So there's some types of data that you can get that might be difficult to get elsewhere. So for example, that we basically, this is a natural randomized experiment, but it turns out that there's randomization on who goes on the Hajj. It's very difficult. People have come up with very interesting identification strategies for getting the effect of religion in our society, but you don't have that many randomized, natural randomized experiments. Or somebody who just recently graduated from the Kennedy schools from Vietnam, he just asked a big firm in Vietnam for data on the bribes they paid, and they happily handed it over. They kept very good records of this. So there's sort of some data that you can get that you wouldn't be able to get elsewhere. Okay. It's also just cheaper. So if you're interested in experiments, which I'll mostly talk about in the afternoon, it's often just much cheaper to run these experiments in a developing country. Surveyors are, it's much cheaper to hire survey enumerators. And the cost of intervention, to make a difference a substantial difference in the per pupil spending in the US, it's going to be, for a significant number of pupils or schools, fantastically expensive beyond most of our research budgets. It's actually quite doable in developing countries. It's also because NGOs, that's development speak for nonprofit organizations, they play a huge role in a lot of developing countries. And so they can be spending amounts that are very significant relative to government budgets. And they're not serving they're not expected to serve the entire country. So you can get a lot of variation from that, either non-experimental variation, or as I'll talk about in the second half, there's scope for experimental variation. And of course, they don't have all of the constraints that governments can do. They're more free to try new things. Okay. So suppose you want to work on development. Should you do field research? Okay, this, I think there's a certain sense in which the wave of field research has been so influential, people sometimes assume that if you're going to work in development, you have to do field experiments or field work. I don't think that's the case. There's a lot that can be done with existing data sets. And there's more and more data sets that are available. There's many of them. I'm just putting up a couple here, but there's DHS and LSMS surveys. These are household surveys from many countries around the world that are set up in comparable ways and are available electronically. And there's increasingly firm studies as well. If those are sufficient to answer your question, then that's definitely the way to go. Collecting your own data is it's very time consuming, both in the sense of it takes a lot of time for it to happen, also it takes a lot of your time as a researcher. It's also risky. You can be doing this and it can turn out your data's no good, or you can't collect your data after spending lots of time developing your questionnaires. So, if you can use existing data sets, that's definitely the way to go. Okay. One caveat to that is, I think if you're interested in working in development, not so much as a one-off project, but on a longer-term basis, it's useful to have experience in developing country. That just helps in figuring out what questions to ask and thinking about what the hypothesis should be. It also helps in sort of reality testing certain data. If you see, should you believe data on the number of kids who are enrolled in school, or should you even think about, is the question of enrollment in school the right concept, or is it just kids sometimes go in and out of school, and so you need data on whether kids are there on a particular day? That's something you'll have a feel for if you've spent time in a developing country. Might not be otherwise. But you don't have to get that experience by doing field research in developing countries. You might be from a developing country. You might have spent significant time there as a Peace Corps volunteer, or you might have relatives there. But if you are going to do field research, where to do it? So just to come back to this, so if you do want to work in development, and aside from the particular question you're answering, if you don't have that sort of on-the-ground experience, it's probably a good idea to pick it up at some point in your career, but doesn't have to be immediately. Okay. Where to do field research? Well, I think it's always easier to do it in a place you already know. So if you're from a country, it's easier. It makes sense to strongly consider doing it there. And if you think about some of the, there are lots of examples of very nice work done from people who are from a particular country. For example, the work on property rights in Argentina, or the work on water privatization in Argentina by Szergrodzki and Ditella and Galliani. If you're doing multiple projects, there's a lot of advantages. So a lot of my work is in Kenya. I think there are a lot of advantages to, some people, Dean Carlin will be doing work in 15 different countries at the same time. I think, at least in my case, I find it easier to stick to try and concentrate it, just to cut down on fixed costs of travel and also of learning about a particular society. You can think about where collaborators and survey infrastructure are available. Those are pretty important in doing work. Rural versus urban areas. In rural areas, transport costs can eat up a lot of your budget, getting from one household that you're surveying to another. In urban areas, you may be able to reduce those costs, but there may be other issues of safety or crime. Enumerator salaries might be higher. Okay. What are reasons not to collect field data? Well, I've mentioned some of these already. Just to go on into a bit more detail, there's a real, you're dependent on permission from the governments and from permission from the people who are giving you the data. And there can be, that takes, just as in when you're collecting any data, that requires a lot of face time, and sometimes you can think everything's going well, and then it ends. You also may be relying on a survey firm in a society where there may not be that many survey firms, and you may get delays on that end. Data quality can go wrong. You can realize you made a mistake in your data collection and need to go back. There's the risk of natural disasters or human disasters. The post-election violence in Kenya required an interruption in field work for several months. And there's lots of management, so it's time-consuming. So it's not something to get into too lightly. But okay, if you are collecting data, there are a lot of different potential methods of collecting this. So it's typically useful to start off with some sort of qualitative research to think about what the possible hypotheses might be. To the extent that you can find existing administrative records, that can make your life a lot easier. They typically have very high coverage. So if you're, but it's worth spending some time trying to understand that data. Sometimes there'll be official incentives will distort those. So for example, in India, schools will get subsidies per child enrolled, so they want to report very high enrollment. That enrollment doesn't necessarily mean something. Or it could just be lack of incentives. They may not bother to collect the data accurately. Attendance data, maybe the teachers are just filling that out at the end of the month or the end of the semester. Surveys cost more than getting administrative data, and they allow you to develop the questions you need. But one problem is people may distort their true preferences. So if you're asking about sensitive questions, say sexual behavior, you may have problems. It's true preferences or behavior. Some things that are worth considering, that satellite data is increasingly available and can be used for more and more things. So there's papers that you can use this to get at forest cover if you're interested in an issue like deforestation. Turns out I'm interested in, Esther Duflo and John Robinson and I are interested in fertilizer use. So we were thinking, well, we go out and we survey farmers about whether they're using fertilizer. And when we were doing sort of small things, this was doable. But we're now thinking about trying to get at social interactions and learning, so we might want to get at this at a large scale. I just learned, I'm not sure this is going to be right, but two real scientists, as opposed to us economists, have told me that you can actually find out how much fertilizer has been used through satellite photographs. They can figure out how much nitrogen is in crops. So there's more and more that can be done with survey data. Obviously, it's a way to get a lot of data at reasonable cost. Very big setup costs in using fertilizer data. It takes, in using satellite data, but it may be useful. GPS, when you're doing surveys, it makes sense to get GPS locations. Another way to get data is to generate your own administrative data. So for example, if you're handing out coupons if you want to understand take-up of a product, you can hand out coupons for that product, and then you can have data on redemption of those coupons. And that can be cheaper than actually going around and surveying people. Okay, and obviously you're getting actual behavior. And finally, you can do some things that are trying to combine, sort of coming from the social experiment tradition, where a lot of the development field experiments come out of, and the lab experiment tradition, you can ask people to play games. And there's now a fair amount of evidence that those are quite correlated with real-world behavior certainly in social experiments, but more broadly. They can be, it's expensive to do those, and you obviously need to know what you're doing and think about what you're measuring in this particular context. One issue that may be more of an issue that applies, I think, in a developing country context, applies to games. It probably applies to certainly applies to surveys as well. People may be answering questions with hoping to get aid. So aid in many developing countries is quite significant, and people may, and because there are so many NGOs out there, they may be trying to answer strategically, and they may be trying. Possibly, they might be trying to play games strategically, although we don't know that for sure. You can also hold, if you're interested sometimes you're interested in political or social processes. These are often very difficult to get random variation on in a developed country context. But in a developing country context, sometimes you can get lots of interesting variation with this. So there's a whole set of community-driven development projects out there. So this is very popular among certain development donors right now, which is ways of organizing the community, having discussions to get them to decide on what development projects to do. And there's a view that this is going to help lead to better, to improve social capital, and that will show up in more participatory decision-making in other contexts. Okay, it's a whole theory. Who knows whether it's right. If you're interested in those issues, you can actually observe political processes. So that's obviously quite expensive to do. But you can, if you're sitting in on these meetings, and you can get a lot of data. And it's a situation where people have incentives to, I would say, costly for people to hide their true preferences. Maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. People may be behaving strategically in a political situation for all the usual reasons, but it's costly for them to behave strategically to impress the enumerator. So you can observe a village meeting and see, for example, are women speaking in the meeting. So this is something that Esther Duflo and Rohini Pandey have looked at and shown that in villages in India where there's been reservations, the Indian word for affirmative action for women, so a woman has been the leader of the village. Later, they show that women are more likely to speak up in meetings afterwards. Okay. To do this, you're going to need the same type of event held both in the the treatment and comparison areas, and you need to know when the event's going to happen so you can show up to observe it. But it can be a useful way of collecting data. So in addition to sort of the standard surveys, in addition to surveys and games, you can observe actual political outcomes. Okay. Okay. Let me talk about a few different types of. Let me talk about some general issues on survey design, and then I'll go through looking at some particular areas. Okay. So in thinking about surveys, you first have to start out with what hypotheses you want to test, and then think about what variables or combination of variables you need to test those hypotheses. It's typically good, rather than making up questions from scratch, to sort of check existing surveys. And there are a lot of them out there. They're online, everything from the World Values Survey to lots of sort of household consumption surveys that have been put together by the World Bank and others. It's generally good if you're to think about not just the final variables, but also some of the pathways and get the intermediate variables. And if you're trying to collect data in an area where others have expertise, say medical area, it's very useful to get advice from them. Let me give you an example. This example from the U.S., but in the Moving to Opportunity study, they wanted to get just anthropometric data, height and weight of people. You would think that getting people's weight is a pretty straightforward thing to do. Do you really need to bring in the doctors to tell you how to measure somebody's weight? It turns out that actually getting weight is pretty tricky. And in the US case, the people had difficulty, the enumerators, survey enumerators had difficulty with, there were pounds and there were kilograms on the scale. they got messed up, and it was very hard to use this data. They may have eventually fixed that problem. It was a significant problem for them at the time. And certainly, we've had, in my own work, we've had problems getting that very basic height and weight data. So one reason is experts can help you get it better. But a second reason is if you're interested in communicating with beyond economists to a broader audience, the doctors may just not listen to you if you're not using the right type of scale. In many cases, I think we economists are right. This is if there's noise on the if there's noise on the left-hand side of the equation, with them, we don't have to worry about it that much. But that doesn't mean the doctors are going to see it that way, and you may want to communicate with them. Education's obviously that's another area where I've worked, where there's a lot of expertise among experts in that area. Obviously, there's costs of doing this, of bringing this in, and how much you want to spend, how much effort you want to spend depends on the size of your survey and the important centrality of this variable. There's very much. I think one thing that needs to be done more is I'm going to be many guidebooks on sort of doing field work are sort of lists of do everything under the sun without worrying about budget constraints, and I'm going to be a little bit guilty of that myself. But I think a step forward in thinking about these issues would be to sort of be very explicit about budget constraints. And we started to hear some of that in the previous talk about when you're thinking about sample size. But doing that more I think is something we should we need to do. Okay, so actually that's my next slide. Considering the constraints. So you have to think about how long do you want the survey to be. How you have to trade off the number of observations you have against the length of each observation with a fixed budget. You also have to think about what's the capacity of your enumeration team, and what's the capacity of the respondents to provide the information, their willingness and their ability. Now, in general, people in developing countries are much more willing. They have a lot more patience in answering questions than people in rich countries. We just you get the phone call and you hang up. Generally, the poorer somebody is, the more willing they are to spend time with a survey firm. So if you're doing farmers in developing countries, they'll spend a lot more time than if you're doing shopkeepers. So there is more room there in a developing country setting, but there's still some important issues. First, people may not be willing to provide accurate information, and in that case, you may want to try to find proxy variables. So Esther Duflo, Pascaline Dupas, Samuel Senet, and I were involved in a project looking at HIV/AIDS education, and we thought that might lead that treatment. This was a randomized evaluation. We thought the treatment there might lead people to self-report safe sex or no sex. So we looked at pregnancy data instead, thinking that risky sex can lead to AIDS. It can also lead to pregnancy. And this was a primary school population, so we thought that might be an okay proxy. There are problems with that as a proxy. It's not that that's a separate discussion, but thinking about things that are that are sort of harder to fake might make sense. Okay. I think it's also worth noting that people's where possible, if you can get objective outcomes, that's desirable. So Ben Olkins did work on corruption in Indonesia. A lot of the corruption perception work finds that ethnically heterogeneous societies have more corruption, and that had even been used as an instrument for. It turns out that in Ben's work, he actually looks at corruption in road building. He actually takes a sample from the road to see how much of different types of material had been applied there to measure the amount of corruption relative to what was the amount of material that was supposed to be there. That's one common form of corruption. Turns out that there's a systematic measurement error. Ethnically more diverse villages report more corruption, holding constant the actual amount of corruption. So to the extent that you can get harder data, that's useful. Okay. I mentioned using publicly available instruments. You may need to adapt those, okay, just for the local society. Let's move over this a little bit further. It often makes sense to design a questionnaire by module. So rather than sort of skip around from topic to topic, I don't know whether I'm doing that in this lecture, but a well-designed lecture or a well-designed questionnaire will tend to cover one topic at a time, and that makes it easier both for the enumerator and for the respondent. Usually, so you see something here called metadata. That's things like when was the interview conducted, who was the enumerator. It's very useful to keep that. If you later find out one of your enumerators is making up data, you want to know who did which interview, for example. You also might want to test for enumerator effects, or does it make a difference if there's a male or female enumerator asking the question. Collecting the household roster early makes sense. That's before people have lost patience with you. When you're on, cousin number 15, if later, if you get a list of all the cousins or all the people living in the household, and there's, eight of them, then later when you're asking how much time did each person spend collecting firewood, you haven't left somebody out. Okay? Makes sense to start the questionnaire with some straightforward things. If you're going to be asking about sexual behavior or which political party did you vote for, probably put that towards the end so you get as much data from people as possible. Okay. Even though people in developing countries are often more patient in answering questionnaires, you get surveys that are 5 to 6 hours in some cases that the World Bank does. You should still try to keep this under control. If you can do it faster, that's good. You should write out your questions. These are just some common sense things, but they're, I think it's worth spending some time on them. So the interviewer can read them verbatim. You don't want each interviewer sort of taking some question like main occupation and translating it his or her own way, because then you may get very different questions asked to different people. The whole idea of occupation, for example, isn't as simple in a developing country where lots of people are doing sort of 4 or 5 different jobs at the same time. They're farmers, but they're also in the off-season doing some trading, for example. If you can, if you keep questions simple and singular, sort of rather than asking sort of complicated and/or questions, that makes sense. So breaking them up. Okay. It's worth specifying who's the preferred respondent. So when the survey enumerator shows up at the household, who do they ask for? And that depends on the question you're asking and on the way the society is structured. But typically, if you're interested in child health, you probably want to find the mother of the youngest child, for example. If you're asking about expenditure, maybe the household head. Okay? It's good to write up a guidebook or a manual with precise definitions of what you mean by things. What's a household that's complicated in a society, for example, where there might be polygamy? And do you mean the mother and her children plus the husband, or do you mean all of the co-wives? Having instructions within the questionnaire for the enumerator, often sort of broken off typographically, either all capitals or italics or something like that, can be quite useful, including skip codes. If yes, then skip to question 37. And definitely pre-code the questions. Try and use as much consistency as possible. You don't want one to mean yes some places and no other places, and male and female should be coded similarly. You clearly want don't know questions, don't know codes. So if the questionnaire is going to be, if the questionnaire is going to be administered in other languages, probably write it I'm assuming that you'll be writing your questionnaire originally in English. Maybe that won't be the case, but if you're writing it originally in English, then translate it to have someone translate it to, say, Swahili or whatever the language will be, and then have somebody back translate it. And then look at the back translation and see if it corresponds to the original. Okay? You obviously have to field test the instrument as well. Okay? You often find that it's a few questions which are causing your enumerators most of the trouble in the interview. And sort of talking to the enumerators, which questions are problematic and how can you improve them, can be very valuable. I mean, the enumerators are a very good source of information. Okay. Let me give some examples here. This is an example from Sierra Leone. They asked people, what groups are you a member of? And somebody said, I'm not a member of any group. Well, then, if you develop a list of groups, what they switched to was they developed a list of all the groups. The religious groups or credit associations, rotating credit associations. If you have a list of the groups and you say, are you a member of this group? Are you a member of that group, et cetera? That's a much better way of collecting data. And in this case, they may not have wanted to say this for fear that they may have been hoping to get aid. Okay, here's a case where somebody said that they were community members said they were involved in a decision, even though the enumerators had seen the person who made the decision make it without consulting them. So there are a number of issues you have to think about. Okay, measuring consumption. So the standard question to ask to get at socioeconomic status in a rich country would be income. Typically people measure income rather than consumption. And in a society like the United States, where most people are getting a regular salary or wage, it's very easy to, it's well defined. People will know it. So it's much more expensive in a U.S. context to measure consumption. People are consuming all sorts of things. In developing countries, it's much more typical to measure consumption. Obviously, these are theoretically very different concepts. There's some theoretical advantages of consumption that's smoother. People may be more, but there's also a bunch of practical things. People may be less reluctant to share information on it. If they're worried of asking somebody how much money they made, they may be worried about taxes, or are you going to try and take some from me, or my neighbor is going to find out and ask me for money. It's also quite conceptually difficult if people are running some sort of small-scale business, because they're what's personal, what's business is quite complicated. Obviously, you get the same issue showing up when you're trying to measure business profits. Okay, consumption's generally easier because people often aren't consuming that many different things. You clearly want to get at home consumption, sometimes in-kind consumption from employers, consumptions from stock, from what you had at home. Okay, let me skip about price data. But that can be an important issue. Okay, I'm going to skip over this a little bit. One issue is what recall period to ask for. So you can have people are more likely to remember consumption over a short period. What did I eat yesterday as opposed to what did I eat over the last week? Okay, on the other hand, there's more variation, random variation in what you ate yesterday. Maybe if you have meat once a week, maybe it was a day you had meat, maybe it wasn't. So it's nice if you're just concerned about averages, you can just have a short recall period, and it'll average out across the respondents. On the other hand, if you're interested in getting at higher moments of the distribution, then you might need to ask about longer periods. If you want to get what's the distribution of meat eating, and if everybody's eating meat once a week, you'd falsely conclude that some people are eating meat if you only asked about yesterday, you might falsely conclude some people eat meat every day and some people never eat meat. Okay. Clearly, you want as much consistency across your different modules as possible. These aren't just theoretical concerns, quite huge differences. So, the cheapest way as Angus Deaton has shown, sort of the cheapest way to reduce poverty in India would just be to reduce the recall period, right? So moving on to perhaps even harder challenges. If you're trying to get data on firms, I'll focus here on small firms, but I think there's going to be another set of issues for larger firms. A little bit of a digression there. I think there's a lot of a lot of the research is focused on micro enterprises, but obviously there's a lot of room for additional research on larger firms. So most firms, so DeMel, McKinsey, and Woodruff are thinking about very small firms are not keeping records, not paying taxes. They're moving money back and forth all the time between household and business accounts. Businesses in general will have lags between their expenses and their revenue. And I think in either small or large firms, the owners may be very reluctant to share information. The large firms, probably are very worried about taxes and government. There's issues about how you value family time. Small firms, family members are probably doing most or all of the work. How do you value their time? If they're sitting there watching, somebody's watching the store and watching their kid, how do you value, should you attribute when you're calculating profits for this firm, what wage rate do you attribute to them? So they did a bookkeeping experiment where they asked firms to keep ledger books, and they had people come and observe the firms. They found big gaps between, if you take the reported revenues, reported expenses, sort of took the gap, you found that did not do too well. And in fact, the correlation between profits and the difference between expenses and revenues was, under 0.5. So they argue that you should just ask. I haven't done work in this area myself, so I'm not really, competent to judge. But those people who've worked on this a bit think it's better to just simply ask about profits straight out. Okay. I'm going to skip ahead to some data collection issues here, and then before coming back to attrition. So it's good to, there's lots of opportunities for things to go wrong in data collection. So you want data supervisors who check the work of the interviewers. And you need a checklist for that of things they should check. Was everything filled out that should be, for example? They should also do some revisits. If you're doing collection in multiple rounds, get the GPS location, get some data on questions that shouldn't change over time so you can check it. Okay? You should definitely do a pilot. Okay? And often in the pilot, you'll find out additional things. Sorry, I had some problems with my slides, so there's a little bit of repetition here. You might want to randomize the order in which some things about your data collection process. The order in which you ask questions, the characteristics of the enumerators, how frequently you collect the data. And if you find that the answers are varying a lot, that's a red flag. Data entry is another place where you have to put in a fair amount of attention. It makes sense to enter data as quickly as possible. Ideally, you've got this going in real time so that you can, if there are problems, you can catch them. If you wait if your data gets entered 6 months after all the interviews are done, then if there was a problem with the way your interviews were being done, it's too late to change it. Okay? Now, the real way to do that, and what clearly I think people will be doing in the future, is collecting the data and skipping the data entry step altogether. The data would go immediately into a laptop or a PDA or into a cell phone, and straight to a database. The kinks in all those systems haven't necessarily been ironed out. So, a number of people I know most people I know are still using paper survey forms in developing countries. But I hope that will change soon. Clearly, you want to have a good data entry base to reduce data entry error. Do the double entry of the data, and then do some checks. Okay. And then, do data cleaning after that to look for problems. Okay, let me come back to these budget issues. Let me come back to. Okay. So attrition, if you're doing a panel survey, so if you're doing a randomized evaluation, you're most of the time you're going to want a baseline and an end line. But even if it's not a randomized evaluation, it's often people want longitudinal data. In developed countries, the main reason you get attrition is because people say, I'm sick of you, I don't want to be interviewed anymore. That's much less likely in developing country. But on the other hand, it can be hard to find somebody. Because households are splitting up, consolidating. There's a lot of migration, a lot of temporary migration. People go to the city to work for a while. And addresses may not exist in a codified form. You might also get that the enumerators don't feel like they're not willing to talk to somebody of high status. So many surveys don't keep a lot of records of attrition. So clearly you should keep track of that. Here's some data from Thomas, Frankenberg, and Smith. They show that there's a systematic relationship. This is in Indonesia between the likelihood of attrition and income. Okay? Tends to be the higher income people who are going to go move in this case. Okay? Very low income and also the higher people. So if they were interested in what are the trends in income in their sample over time, they would get that wrong if they're not accounting for attrition. Okay? But the other thing that they showed, so they just took sort of a maniacal approach to we're going to minimize attrition and we're going to find people. So what they did was they got information from neighbors, relatives, community leaders to try and find out where they are. If they were in the local area, during the field work, they tried to find them. If they'd moved, then they sort of collected a bunch of names and then they went to go find them. So I've been involved in similar things in Kenya with, Ted Miguel is taking the lead on. When you do that, you can actually get, with some effort, and it is a lot of effort and expense, but you can get quite high follow-up rates. And some of the work that Thomas has done suggests this makes a real difference. Okay, but it raised the total budget by 20%. Whether that's going to be important may depend on what you're doing. Okay. Cell phones, I think, are going to make this a lot easier over time. Okay, you can collect, but asking. You can also ask for people who have lots of relatives. So in the initial survey, you can say, okay, who in your family would know, in your family or elsewhere, would know where you might be if you're not here, and do you have a cell phone number for them? You can also budget for tracking initially. Okay, there's various things you can do to adjust for attrition, obviously, if it doesn't work out. I'm going to come back to these mirror measurement effects. Let me discuss a couple more. Couple more administrative issues beforehand. No, sorry, I'll go back in. Okay, so attrition is one thing. That can be handled. Here's something that I think is quite worrisome. And this is new work that's being done by a variety of authors. I think some of this started with Dean Carlin and Jonathan Zinman. This is work that suggests that surveying people can affect behavior. So generally what they're doing here is they have some data, some random variation in who was surveyed or in the frequency with which they were surveyed. And then they have some administrative data or other objective data on take-up of some product, like a financial product, an insurance product, or a health product. So in 4 out of 5 of the cases they looked at, and this is not, this is not yet complete work. Maybe it'll turn out, maybe it'll change. They found that the people who were surveyed were significantly more likely to take up the product. So in other words, if you get surveyed about health, you're more likely to take up health insurance later. Okay? This wasn't a survey that was pushing you to take up health insurance. So they found this for health in the Philippines, for microcredit in Morocco, microloans in India. So there's a large group of people who may wind up with a joint paper on this. Let me see if Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee are involved. I've got this in some other section of my slide, which I can't find. I may be involved as well. I'd been doing, I don't know whether it'll be a single paper or not, but let me tell you about the work that we did. So I've been doing work on water treatment and diarrhea. So there's a huge, so basically, we were studying the effect of cleaner water on diarrhea. Diarrhea kills 2 million kids a year, so it's a very big health problem. And so we collected data the way economists would normally do it. We got a large sample of people, and we interviewed them about diarrhea. It turns out the public health people think that the way they typically do things is they have a smaller sample, and they go back every 2 weeks. Short recall periods are relevant. So we went back and tried to do it the public health way, having not adequately taken the advice here of sort of learning about the way people in the field do it. It turned out, well, I'll argue we economists were right in this case. But so we had biweekly prevalence measures, and we had these sort of annual data from a comparable population. It was random which type of data collection we had. So if you look at this sort of solid line, these are the ones that had biweekly monitoring. So you see that diarrhea prevalence sort of falls a lot over time. Okay, that could be seasonal effects. Is there flooding? Is it the rainy season or the dry season? But what we noticed was these households that were getting less frequent monitoring, which should have been totally comparable, These were all comparison, there were treatments going on, but these are all comparison households. They had much higher levels of reporting. So reporting went down from 20% to 5%. Okay? And that's, and if you look at the households that had less frequent monitoring, it's sort of at the 10% level. So it looks like the very act of asking people about diarrhea is changing their reported diarrhea. Now that could be for two reasons. Could be that it's changing their reporting behavior. They know that if you say, yes, my kid had diarrhea, then you get a whole bunch of extra questions. You know, was there blood in the stool, et cetera. Maybe people aren't so excited about discussing all those things, so they just say, no, my kid didn't have diarrhea. But it turns out that it's not just that. It seems to have changed actual behavior, not just reporting error. Because we tested their water to see if there was chlorine in their water. And people who had more frequent questions about diarrhea were more likely to have chlorine in their water. So they were more, so the very fact of measuring seems to affect behavior. This is, as I said earlier, this is an issue not just, for randomized evaluations, but it's an issue for data collection more generally. One way to deal with this, one lesson we took from this is, this may be a problem even with infrequent data collection, but the more frequent the data collection, the more a problem it is. Okay. Okay. I talked about data collection and management already. Talk a little bit about some very practical things about budgeting and finance for these. So it's important to, there's a real trap of not budgeting adequately for these. So it's very easy to sort of work out a bare bones budget, but not include any overhead for the people who are doing this, not allow for things to go wrong, not, sort of assume that the existing exchange rate's going to be there, that your enumerators are going to be, that they can do 4 surveys a day, and that they can do that every day, when in fact there's going to be some days when the roads are, you can't get out because the roads are too muddy, or because there's a scheduling problem of some other sort. You'll need to resurvey some people because you'll find that you had a mistake in the questionnaire probably. Those are all things that can go wrong, but there are also things that can go right. You may have opportunities to do some new things that are very exciting with a little bit of extra budget. So it's better to don't promise too much, or you'll find yourself in a difficult situation. Okay, what are some funding sources? I've put the NSF up there. I'm putting that up there not so much because it's a big funder for this sort of thing, but because that's what probably most economists are familiar with. The funders for this type of work are often very different in a lot of ways. Let me start with the NIH, which might be, which like the NSF is going to be thinking about this from a scientific point of view. So the NIH relative, I hope I'm not going to, offend people here and end any future funding, but the NIH relative to the NSF is they're very detail oriented. So they're going to, they'll want a lot of details on exactly how you're going to do everything. And you often have to go through multiple rounds with the NIH. So it's not, don't get too discouraged if you applied the NIH and you get turned down. That's standard, and you typically have to come back. There's some word that might be changing. I don't know whether it actually has. Okay. The other two funders I have up here, and obviously there are lots of other ones, are even more different. So the World Bank has a research department which has some funding, but there's also a lot of potential operational funding in the World Bank. There, it's very different than either of these research funders. Their ultimate job is development, not research. And they're bureaucratically quite different, and they have lots of different pots of money. This may be true for any funder. There's special programs at the NIH or NSF where they have a particular topic. But those are likely to be very tightly delimited at the World Bank. They have a pot of money. The World Bank you think of as having some large, billions of dollars, but they actually have, lots of money in different accounts for very particular purposes. This is for vocational education in Tanzania. So if you happen to be doing something on vocational education in Tanzania, you might be able to access that money. But the difficulty is, how do you find out that they have a pot of money for vocational education in Tanzania? And even if you read the materials, it may not be very clear because it may be described in terms that only make sense to somebody who speaks the bureaucratic language of the World Bank, and only somebody within the World Bank may know. I'm not generalizing about the World Bank as a whole. There's all sorts of pots, some of which are much more open, but there are certainly some things where only somebody who's working on the education sector for the World Bank in Tanzania would be able to, if you happen to know that person, they may be able to explain to you that money is potentially applicable to something you would want to do. So that makes it sort of potentially hard to access, either very hard to access that type of funding or very easy. If it's worth trying to establish some relationships with, if you're working in a country on a long-run basis, it may be worth establishing a relationship with the World Bank people working in that country, because there may be, if they have an interest in research, and many of them do. A lot of them are PhD economists who are quite interested in research. Others have no interest in it, but it's probably worth feeling those people out, and there may be, there may be opportunity to support some of your work. There's the Gates Foundation, which particularly for health work, but not just health, also microfinance and other things, is a big funder in development. Again, they're really not, they're into scientific research, developing new vaccines, but their social science research is not what they're about. So it would be incidental if you happen to qualify, but you might, particularly if you're doing certain areas. So because these latter two funders are very much about development rather than about research, your proposal, relative to, say, a proposal you'd write for the National Science Foundation, you have to spend a lot of time talking about how will you disseminate the results within the country. And they're going to care also a lot about capacity building within the country. I don't mean to claim that these things aren't at all important to the NSF. There are analogous things that are important to the NSF, but I think the relative weights, my impression at least, is the relative weights are very high for relative to what you might be used to for some of these other funders. Another thing is that these funders they like co-financing. Okay? So I think it's very much like co-authorship. Right? If there's 2 or 3 authors on something and you add up the credit they each get, it sums to more than one. Similarly, if the World Bank is funding part of it and NIH is funding part of it and USAID is funding part of it, they can all claim credit to their bosses for helping get this done. And there's another advantage of co-financing, I think, bureaucratically, which is you won't get in that much trouble if you can say, well, if the World Bank person can say, well, I think it must have been scientifically good because NIH approved it. So there can be sort of hurting effects of that type. And that means that you can often have a sequence of funders. So you may well, particularly for projects that go on for a while and are expensive, you may get some funding initially from one funder and then funding from other funders later on. One other thing about this is the people who read these don't speak, they don't necessarily, who judge these don't necessarily speak economics jargon. So you should think about, what language you use. And of course, they may use their own language, which we may have to learn. An example of this was somebody who was, coming out of behavioral economics literature and was interested in working on sex workers, talked about the self-control problems of sex workers. And the reviewers thought this was incredibly politically incorrect, and that wasn't, that in fact, they were just using the standard behavioral economics terms. So, you choose your language carefully when you write. Okay. Okay. There's a lot of. I want to talk some about the approval process. Obviously, one thing that we're familiar with, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, is human subjects approvals. So those you'd think of primarily on the U.S. side, but there may also be approvals to go through in the country where you're working. They can take a lot of time. So it's important to, when you work out your timelines and your plan, to budget for that. Don't set yourself up in a situation where your survey has to start at a certain date without that date being far enough away to go through multiple iterations with the human subjects people. There are some issues that are going to be different in a developing country and developed country context, a variety of them, but let me point to one, which is oral versus written consent. There may be many cases, so written consent would obviously be the standard in a developed country context. In a case where people are illiterate, you may want to go to oral consent. There's a second reason why oral consent might be appropriate, which is if people are sort of partially literate, they may be able to sign their name, but they may be very afraid that if they're signing their name to something, they're signing away their land or something like that. And so the whole idea of consent is quite standard to us, but it's quite alien in these settings. You have to do it as a human subjects requirement, but it's something that, because it's alien, people may be scared to sign their name, not because they're not happy to answer the questionnaire, but because they're worried about what else it implies. I've generally found that if you talk to the Human Subjects Committee about this, that they're flexible, but I'm sure that varies from Human Subjects Committee to committee. Okay. There are other permissions. So there's permission from the national government. There's also permissions from local authorities. So it's often the case that if you're working in a district, there's often a matrix organization to a government in a developing country. So there'll be somebody in charge of a district, and then there'll be somebody in charge of education. Then there'll be an education ministry. So typically, you need to visit these people. If you're, you can't just go to the national government and get your study on education approved. You probably also, in each of the districts you're working, you have to go visit the district commissioner as well and the district education officer. That's a time-consuming process, but it can actually, first, if you don't do it, you're going to wind up with more problems later on because the headmaster is going to say, I can't do this without a letter from the district education officer, even though you've got a letter from the national government. But second, you can actually make use of these as key informants. So when you're visiting them, in some cases, they can help you find the people that you're looking for. That might not be so relevant for schools, but it might be relevant if you've got a list of households and you're trying to find them. The assistant chief in the area might be able to take you around to find them. In fact, they might even be able to get them to come to their office so you can interview them there. Those guys may be quite upset if you skip them. They don't want people messing around in their area without stopping their office first. And if you're going to talk to them, you might as well collect some information from them. So if you collect, and they may be much better at answering certain questions. So I haven't found this a problem, but I know some people who are working in poorer and less developed countries than Kenya, people have, rural people may have trouble estimating distances to say the local hospital or the capital or things like that. But the head of the local government presumably is going to be more able to do that. So, okay. Okay. Let me, let me wind things up here. So I've sort of gone through a lot of areas where, a lot of things that can go wrong and sort of mentioned a lot of steps that you have to take to deal with them. So these things, as I said earlier, do tend to be a huge amount of work to implement. On the other hand, if you think about the list of papers that I talked about earlier, these are things that are clearly having a very big intellectual impact. There are also things that are very much having a real-world policy impact, and are in some cases. Just to give an anecdote from my own experience, one of the things that we worked on was trying to understand why kids aren't in school who are in school. And we looked at a whole variety of different things, a whole variety of different programs, working with a nonprofit organization in Kenya. Everything from paying for school uniforms, which households had to buy, school meals. Turned out the thing that made the most difference was treating kids for worms. And this, you could treat these kids for worms. For the medicine costs 2 pennies a day. Huge proportion of kids are infected. And this is something that, first, you probably, if you were thinking about this abstractly, not spending time in the field, you probably wouldn't even have gotten onto your list. Spending time in the field sort of gets it onto your list. And then once it's on your list, doing this sort of field work can establish it, can establish the fact in ways that deal with causality, but also can establish them in ways that are very convincing to policymakers. And with that evidence, obviously in some cases things will be politically, you're not going to be able to, you can have all the evidence in the world and it's not going to make a difference to policy. But if you have something like this that's very cheap, that's not particularly politically controversial, this is something that if you have the right policymakers in place, they may listen to it. And as in particular in this case, the government of Kenya decided to scale up a treatment for worms and just treated 3 million kids. So this is an example of how this sort of field work can have very big impact in the real world. And I at least find that despite all of the work involved, it's worth doing. So let me end there, and maybe we can have some discussion and questions. I'll talk more about experiments in the afternoon. Yes?
I wonder whether you can elaborate on the fact that maybe there is a way to use some of this field work to be kind of almost a complement to surveys rather than kind of being substitute. And if you have ideas on how this can help so that also other people maybe can also benefit from the field survey without actually doing it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So first, I think there can be a lot of complementarity between field work and use of administrative data. So again, let me give an example from my own experience. Columbia did a school voucher program. And the school voucher program, they randomized the school voucher program not for research reasons, but for fairness reasons. We wanted to collect data on what the impact of this was, so we did some field work. We surveyed some people, et cetera. This was very expensive, very time-consuming, we had pretty high attrition rates. We were able to get lists of the people who'd originally applied to this voucher and compare the lottery winners and losers, so very nice identification. But when we were trying to get test score impacts, we got a sample of people, we brought them into a testing center, gave them tests, but we had a lot of attrition in that, and it was a relatively small sample size. Okay. Later, so we had some results, but you can argue about how convincing they were. Later, we were able to link this data to data from the national high school graduation exam that Columbia provides, and there we weren't able. There we were able to basically find out whether people got through high school or not. So we had a much larger sample, much lower attrition, much lower cost to do the same thing. So I think linking up with either administrative data or survey data can be very valuable. Let me mention another thing in response to your question, which is one thing that I think people who do this sort of field work should do, and they're probably not as good at it as they should be, is get the data out and publicly available so that a survey can initially be done for one purpose, but other people may be able to use that data for other purposes, people who are not able in a position to do this, do field work themselves. And there can be lots of reasons, personal reasons. If you've got family and kids, you may not be able to spend that much time in the field. Why people, but there's, it would be, I think making that data available to other people would be very socially beneficial. One of the, a little bit of a digression, but one other point I wanted to make is there are lots of areas in which the institutions of the profession are not set up optimally to incentivize things. That's one example. There's the rewards for getting the data out and publicly available in a timely fashion are not as big as they should be. It takes work to do. Normally it's part of a grant proposal, but people take longer to do it than they should, and I'm certainly guilty of that myself. So, was that answering your question, or is there more?
I sometimes also wonder whether this field data can really complement well some big survey where maybe there is not enough information on
right.
preferences and so on, and so they could also enrich the existing data set in certain directions.
Right, so you're thinking maybe a survey is going on, a national sample survey, and you could go re-interview some of the same people in that survey. Yeah, I think that could potentially be very valuable. You obviously need to get cooperation from the people who did the original big national sample survey. Yes?
Michael, could you say a little bit about how much one can expand the team of researchers and bring in interns or early stage graduate students or pre-graduate students
Yeah.
to do this? Having watched my colleagues at the Poverty Action Lab at MIT do this, I know that there's a active program of bringing people often after they finish as undergraduates, sending them out into the field
Right.
to do this. And I'm just curious as to at what level can you basically bring someone like that into this operation, and how much can you delegate in the process of doing this?
Yeah, another great question. So on the section on data, I think I managed, I don't know if I skipped that slide accidentally, but there's survey firms that collect data. Those survey firms often don't do a very good job. And we can think of all sorts of contracting reasons why, from that branch of economics, why this would be a difficult relationship. You're asking them to do a lot of things that are not very directly observable. It's often a one-shot game. They don't necessarily, do that great work. And many of their clients don't need work done to the same standard that academics do. They're often they work for firms that sort of trying to get some sense of, how much demand for fans or air conditioners there might be in rural India, and they just want to get some rough sense of what proportion of people, own those objects or are thinking about them. So in that, so I think some people use survey firms successfully, but even in that case, they have to have people on the ground monitoring them very closely, where it's more of an employment relationship rather than a contractual relationship. What most of the researchers in this area do, or I don't say most, the other strategy that many researchers use is they have their own teams, sort of who are more or less regular employees, down to maybe not down to the level of the lowest level enumerators, but certainly supervisors who are working on one project after another. Certainly in my own work, I've done a lot of work in Kenya, many different projects, and there's enumerators who have worked on many of these projects. In those settings, it's pretty common to have people who come after either grad students or postdocs or often people straight out of undergrad who've taken undergrad classes and done very well, who go spend time working on this and spend a couple of years in the country. The other thing that I think is very important to do and is to work with collaborators in the country, and they're likely to have the best much deeper understanding of the institutions than somebody who's going over for 2 years after finishing at Stanford. I mean, some of those people from Stanford are great. But it's also good to have collaborators who are based permanently in the country. Yes. Right. So one thing I would say, part of the reason for these lectures, of course, is to try and get some of the more obvious pitfalls, sort of warn people about. But there's always more of them. And so first, it's possible if you're a PhD student at the LSE, it may well be that there's a researcher at MIT who would love to have you working on his or her project. So Poverty Action Lab at MIT does a lot of, it's obviously a center at MIT, but it's also a center that provides services for a lot of people working, not in field work in developing countries in general, but randomized evaluations. So researchers who are affiliated with JPAL, whether or not they're based at MIT, will often advertise for positions there. And so if you're coming from the LSE, if you're a grad student, obviously there are people, if you're a grad student at the LSE, there are plenty of development economists to work with there. But you can, if for some reason you want to work on a particular project that somebody at MIT is doing, you can, or somebody at Harvard or Berkeley is doing, you can advertise, you can respond to one of those ads. There are many cases, so look, a lot of people do this through this sort of apprenticeship system that you've talked about, but not all of them by any means. So, there's let me, thinking about my own experience, I'm working in Western Kenya. Ted Miguel was originally was an undergrad at MIT, and now he's a professor at Berkeley and is doing research there and had sort of had that apprenticeship system. But Ben Olken, for example, he had spent a year living in Indonesia before he started grad school, and then he went back to Indonesia and did an extremely large-scale randomized evaluation there. And it wasn't as if he had spent time sort of working as an apprentice, as an RA on a project in Kenya or India beforehand. And there are many examples like that as well. So, so it's it can make things easier, but it's not necessary. Yes?
I had a couple of questions. One was on the documentation of the data after it's collected.
Right.
And you must be aware that at the World Bank, the International Household Survey Network has a very nice microdata documentation toolkit which can import stuff and create a DDI-compliant file that also identifies where you've got gaps in your documentation. So I found that extremely useful. And then the other one that I wondered whether you might want to address, when I worked for the World Bank collecting data on businesses, one of the problems I had with the statistical institutes with getting a frame for business surveys was they were very concerned about confidentiality. And so, we developed a checklist to reassure the institute that we would protect the confidentiality of the data. And some of that material is also available on that International Household Survey Network. So I didn't know whether you wanted to comment a bit about how you reassured individuals and businesses of confidentiality.
So thanks, those are very helpful comments. And maybe there's a way that, I don't know what the procedures here are at the Bureau, but maybe there's a way I can get some sites to those and put them on the web so that people who see this can reference that. On assuring people about confidentiality, so clearly there's consent statements in interviews, and there can be, obviously there should be procedures for how you handle the data as well. Most of my work has been with individuals and relative, sort of farmers who tend not to be quite as concerned about this as, larger as businesses clearly would be. And, the larger the business, probably the more concerned they'll be. I would say that in developing countries, there's generally more willingness to work with researchers than in richer countries, is my general experience. But I'm sure there's plenty of counterexamples to that as well. Yes?
Just to add to that, it seems that researchers have not really paid enough attention to what we call harmonization. That is, questions that are trying to get at the same idea being asked in a similar wording and a similar structure. There's a lot of learning that's already happened in the field, and yet over time what I find is people feel like they need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
And of course some of it's going to be local. You can't ask certain questions of certain cultures and so on. But we've already translated into multiple languages a whole host of questions.
Yeah.
And I've worked primarily with the HRS, but also now in Chile, and some of the questions are already out there. It would be great if there was a centralized locale of the questions with the concepts they're trying to get at. And so then people could almost do like a web-based click, pull down, here are the questions on risk aversion.
Right.
I would like to ask that have been tested in the literature attached to those questions to measure those concepts.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's a lot of reinventing the wheel that goes on, and some local adaptation is sometimes local adaptation is not needed, but I think there's this is another area where we probably need some institutions or slightly different incentives than we currently have. At the same time, it's worth noting that there are some data sets out there that are very nicely comparable across societies. So, DHS data is available in a lot of countries, and it's pretty easy to run a regression with data from 40 countries using that data set. I'll start out by talking about why do randomized evaluation as opposed to just field work in general. Then about the practicalities, when to randomize, how to randomize. Talk about issues of size and power, and then issues in the analysis of the data. So you can think about doing randomized evaluations either to evaluate a particular policy question or a particular program, or to explore theoretical questions. And of course, there's often in the same paper, you may be doing both. I think one thing that we've often found in doing randomized evaluations is that you can wind up in covering new questions that you hadn't thought about. There's a sense in which working with this type of evaluation sort of forces you into a confrontation with reality. Let me give an example. I've done a lot of work on education. So we looked at a variety of things. I mentioned the deworming result before, but we looked at incentives for students to do better. We looked at spending, spending on class size, hiring more teachers to reduce class size, spending on non-teacher inputs. One of the things we found was, it's quite reminiscent of the previous paper, is that kids were scoring way, way below the norms for which the curriculum was set. And in that sort of setting, we've looked at incentives for kids, financial incentives, and financial incentives seem to have helped in our Kenyan context. But the effect that they had was, moderate. It was good. I mean, I think that there's a role for merit scholarships. I'm not trying to knock that at all. But one thing we realized in looking at the things that various development economists have looked at, and some quite similar results in Kenya and India on this, is that there seem to be because the typical class is pitched very differently than where the kid is, there may be large political economy reasons for that, there can actually be very high payoffs from orienting the instruction more towards the level where the typical child is at. Now if you think about it ex post, that's pretty obvious. But that wasn't the sort of question that a lot of economists were focused on initially. It's something that sort of looking at the data and dealing with the situation brings you to. In our case, we were looking at the impact of textbooks. We saw that textbooks didn't seem to raise test scores. Looked at the evidence more carefully, realized that they were raising test scores for the kids who were at the top of the distribution, but not for the kids in the bottom 3/4 of the distribution. Basically, those kids were having trouble using the textbooks at all. And then, since then, there's been more work to try and sort of do remedial education or split classes up, and find big gains for people throughout the distribution from splitting classes up by initial achievement and allowing teachers to concentrate their teaching. So what have been lessons from this sort of wave of randomized evaluations? I think the lessons from them sort of suggest that it's worth doing more of them. First is, I think if you looked 20 years ago, people thought that these sorts of, and I'm not thinking of the lab experiments, I'm coming this very much from the opposite end of the spectrum, the social experiment side. People thought that social experiments were things that, they thought of the negative income tax experiment, Rand health insurance experiment, these experiments in the 70s. Those were evaluations, sort of very large scale, very expensive. I thought this was something that could, sort of very rarely be done. And sort of very much agree with John that, look, there are barriers to entry here, but this is something that we found can be done just by doing them. We found out this can be done much more broadly than we thought before. A second thing we found is that the results often differ from non-experimental studies. So this is, in the US context, we think of Lalonde. This has been repeated over and over again in developing country contexts as well that I'm more familiar with. To take one example, there's a big policy debate on what's the impact of charging fees for health and education. And there's been a big non-experimental literature arguing that people are not going to be necessarily that sensitive to price, with identification strategies that weren't crazy, were the best that at the frontier of the technology available to people, using techniques like how far people were from school as a measure of cost of getting there. You can argue with the identification, but it seemed reasonable. And now that we've got more experimental evidence, it looks like there's a very big impact of price. So sort of a pretty key parameter was pretty widely off. That's of a lot of policy interest, but it's also of a lot of theoretical interest, because it's not clear why a very small price difference, if you're thinking about should I go to school or should I not go to school, why should a few dollars, it'd be a very weird model. Yes, theoretically, you could have a whole bunch of people who are just at the margin of indifference of whether to go to school or whether not to. But probably behavioral model is more plausible. And there's some recent work that sort of narrows this down and provides more definitive evidence that you need to go to behavioral models to explain these price elasticities. So but the general point I was trying to make is that the results from experimental work often differ from non-experimental studies. It's hard to go, that suggests, you can have various explanations for that, but in many cases the most plausible one is that the identification assumptions between the underlying the non-experimental work is leading you astray. So historically, there are a number of ways of types of experiments. These large, I have a typology that's probably overlaps a lot with John's, but differs in some ways. There are these large-scale evaluations of particular government programs, negative income tax experiment. There are lab experiments, so sort of psychologists would do and economists now do. And then there are programs taking advantage of existing randomizations that were done for other reasons, say the draft lottery. I think the wave of new experiments that's come in development economics, I think comes in part from, it started with collaborations between NGOs and academics. So, in my particular case, I taught secondary school in Kenya after college, and then I went back to visit some friends of mine after as an assistant professor. A friend of mine was working for a nonprofit, and his job was to pick some new schools where they would start their program. And I said, have you thought about, thinking that this was a crazy idea, but might as well ask, have you thought about choosing twice as many schools and starting in randomly choosing half to start the program? And they agreed. And it turns out that that's not such a rare experience. That certainly there's some nonprofits that aren't going to be able to do this, but some that will. And then once you've got a relationship established with an organization, and it's been mostly NGOs, but I think in the future it could be for-profits, you can then conduct a number of these evaluations. And that really radically cuts down on the fixed costs. So if you think about the barriers to entry, the fixed costs are a barrier to entry, but the flip side is once you get started, you can continue. If you compare this to the sort of old 1970s experiments, this allows a bunch of alternatives to be examined if you're trying to implement, if you care about a particular outcome, whether that's getting more kids in school, raising test scores, you can compare a variety of alternatives in a similar context. And then you can benchmark against each other for cost effectiveness. You can also have an iterative process. So you can develop hypotheses and then test them further. So we find there's a lot of price sensitivity. Why is that? Well, there's certain behavioral models that might give that, and maybe we could test them. The sort of two developments that I think are worth flagging in terms of sort of the technology for doing this. One is working with firms, which John mentioned, and the second is sort of researchers sort of building up their own NGO to some extent, and that's to some extent that's what IPA, Innovations for Poverty Action, has done, which Dean Carlin heads, but like JPAL, operates in large part as a resource for researchers working in this area. Another frontier is using lab experiments and randomized experiments together. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that. You can use results from the lab as covariates, or as interaction terms. So for example, Ashraf et al. Look at they have people play lab games to see who's subject to a sunk cost effect, and then they see whether they exhibit the same behavior in a real world case. You can also use results from the lab as outcomes. So Duflo look at a case where there's political reservations for women, and then say, and then find that after you've been exposed to a woman as a political leader, they then, as an outcome, they look at how do you react to a speech read by a man versus a woman, how do you rate the quality of that speech? And they show that after you've been exposed to a female political leader, you're more like, you rank the female better relative to the male. This is different. Some people randomly assign females, some randomly assign males. So I mentioned there's a couple of different purposes of randomized evaluations. And the way you design the randomized evaluation may depend in part, and when you can do it, may depend in part on what the primary purpose is. So if you're mainly interested in policy, you may not, I think this is something where there's perhaps not as much clarity as there should be. I don't think you should be doing randomized evaluations everywhere. If you have something that you already know works, there's no point doing another randomized evaluation on it. On the other hand, if it's very early stages, it's probably premature. You first want to do some piloting and sort of get to the stage where you've got some prototype. If the second issue is you want to do a test, if you're thinking about something that you're a training program, and somebody has an idea of a training program for entrepreneurs, and you want to roll this out as policy, then you'd want to test it in realistic circumstances. You wouldn't want to spend, if these are micro entrepreneurs, you wouldn't want to spend $2,000 training each entrepreneur. You wouldn't want to say, we're going to find the best trainers and have them do this program, because you're not really testing a realistic, scalable policy. On the other hand, if your primary purpose is testing theory, then then you really want a strong first stage. And it may, in fact, may not be relevant. It may not be a problem that you've got you're spending a lot of money and you may not have a situation that could be scaled up. So let me give you an example on the issue I tend to spend a lot of time thinking about right now, which is water and sanitation. There's a paper from where a researcher got a whole bunch of very good field workers, trained them to visit households, and encouraged them to wash their hands. They went to these households multiple times a week. Right? And what they found was the huge improvements in health for these households. Now, that's not a scalable policy. I think it's still a very useful study, because this was a doctor. He was interested in trying to understand what's the relationship between hand washing and health. Then the next stage, of course, is that research useful for policy? Well, not directly. You can never replicate that. But but what that research suggests is we now need to think about, from a policy point of view, are there ways to change behavior to encourage hand washing more? And maybe that could be something very different. That could be maybe the implication is we should try and get running water connections in people's house, or we should subsidize soap, or something like that. But that's an example from medicine, but I think we can analogously in more social science settings. If you're interested in testing a theory, maybe you don't worry about the realism and the affordability of this. Okay, so that's some background on sort of different reasons why you might do randomized evaluation. One is if you're looking for if you want to get a believable or well-identified evaluation of a particular policy, and you feel like you don't have, there are going to be some cases where you feel like you've got strong identification from other methods, but there are other cases in which people may not be totally convinced by that. Randomization can provide strong identification. And the other is, it may be that randomization is useful in shedding light on a theoretical question. If you're going to do randomization, how do you do it? Well, there's a number of different designs you can use. I'm going to go through several of them. So the first and simplest is just a pure lottery. Okay? That's going to be useful, for example, when a program's oversubscribed. So when programs are oversubscribed, and if the program is naturally discrete, these are often put in place for fairness reasons. Okay? So the draft lottery, some people are going to be drafted. You could argue the draft isn't fair at all, and that we should allocate this by cash. But given that there's going to be a draft, and a certain number of soldiers are needed, that's used. Or to take another example, I mentioned the example of places on the Hajj. That's naturally a discrete. You can't go halfway to Mecca, I guess. So lottery is done for fairness there. So this can be very intuitive for people. It's transparent. So in many cases, people like these. That's something that I think researchers sometimes have trouble imagining. We think, oh, how can you randomize things? People, in fact, what we found in the field, maybe this is developing country specific, people often like a computer-based lottery, or a lottery where they know researchers are involved, because they otherwise assume everything's going to be allocated in a corrupt way, so they feel like they like a lottery. the disadvantages, well, the control group might resent this in some cases. I think a lot does depend on the context. And you might get differential attrition, and that would be a big concern if you didn't have cooperation from the control group. Okay, another approach is what I'll call a partial lottery. There, the program officer might have very strong views that some people are very well suited for a program, other people are not suited. So in that case, you may not want to randomize the people who most, if you're thinking about the donors, for example, they may not want to, if you're randomizing, do we contact the donor to try to persuade them to give money to our university? Well, the donors they think are really going to give a huge amount of money, they want to go after those no matter what. If the donors who are the graduates who've never given a penny and who've gotten 20 solicitation letters in the past, maybe they don't want to waste postage on them. But there's going to be some people in the middle, and there may be willingness to randomize there. Okay. So this was an example with the expansion of consumer credit in South Africa. So that can be a very useful technique. If pure lottery doesn't seem feasible, this partial lottery may work. Okay, another approach is randomizing phase-in. So you can have a program that eventually is going to reach everybody, but you've randomized the order in which it's phased in. So in many cases, particularly if you're working with nonprofits, they're not going to launch the program all over the country initially or all over the area where they work initially anyway. They're going to phase it in. So it's just a matter of randomizing the order. And an advantage is that can encourage cooperation from the comparison group relative to a pure lottery. A disadvantage is that this can make it difficult to estimate long-run effects. Because everybody gets treated, it's just difference in the dates in which they get treated. So you have a situation where some people have longer exposure than others, but if you're trying to look at long-run impact, you're trying to tease out something pretty small. You also have to worry about expectation effects. Perhaps the fact that people know they're going to be treated later changes their behavior. In some contexts, that'll be something to worry about. In other contexts, it's probably not. And economic theory can probably provide some guide as to when we think that expectations of the future might matter. Okay. Another approach is to randomize within a group. So let me give a concrete example. The Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee, Sean Cole, and Lee Linden looked at a program of remedial education in Indian schools. I referred to this earlier. So they were providing remedial education. I mentioned earlier the very high intra-cluster correlations across schools. Some schools do much better than others on test score measures. So randomizing across schools is you'll have limited statistical power. One way to deal with that is to, within the same school, say all the schools are going to get treated, but some will get treated in 3rd grade, some will get treated in 4th grade, and we'll make that random. Okay. Obviously, concern with that is there might be more contamination. Maybe the 3rd graders have siblings in 4th grade. Maybe some 3rd graders decide, some people who are in 3rd grade who would have gone on to the next year decide, well, I'm going to stay back a year because I know this program's coming in. No particular reason to think that was an issue in this case, but just in general, that's a potential concern. I guess another concern is, even if something like this works in theory, these things have to be implemented in practice. And there's maybe a greater chance that the messages got confused and one of the treatment schools one of the schools was supposed to, 3rd graders were supposed to be treated, 4th graders got treated instead. Okay. Another approach is rotation. So everybody gets treated. Some people get treated today and not treated tomorrow. Other people get treated tomorrow and not treated today. I think that's called a crossover study in the medical literature. You obviously, in some ways, get more data. You have to worry about expectation effects. Again, in medicine, they don't worry about that very much, but in economics, we would. And again, that's going to make it difficult to estimate the long-run effects. Final approach is encouragement. So there are some cases in which it's not really feasible to exclude people. There might be a social program that's written into law that everybody's eligible for. The best case for this is a case where take-up is low, but can be influenced. And again, that's the case for a lot of social programs. A lot of social programs, there's a lot of people who don't, either they don't know they're eligible or they know, but they can't quite get around to signing up. Helping people sign up can boost take-up rates a lot. So that allows you to randomize at the individual level, even if the program isn't implemented at the individual level. There are two concerns with that. The first is that the act of encouragement itself might affect the outcome variable. You might imagine I'll discuss that more in the next slide, but in some cases that's something to worry about, in other cases it's not. Another issue is that there's going to be partial compliance with that. Some of the people who you encourage still aren't going to take up. Some of the people you didn't encourage are going to sign up. So you're going to be estimating the local average treatment effect for the people who complied with the encouragement. Is that depending on the setting, that might be exactly what you're interested in if that's a policy you're evaluating. But in other cases, you may be interested in some other parameter. Okay. So let me give an example of when you'd be worried about the exclusion restriction. If you have a credit program and you're trying to understand what's the impact of getting credit, well, if you're training people and to encourage them to take the credit, then you'd have to worry about the direct effect of the training. If you're just providing out more information, more marketing efforts, that might work. Okay. I wanted to talk about cross-cutting treatment, which is or what people in medicine will call factorial design. So these are quite common in a lot of the economics field experiment literature in developing countries. And there's a number of advantages of them. So you'll have the key advantage. I said there are a number of advantages. There's one really key advantage, which is you economize a lot on data collection and on fixed costs. So to give an example, work with Esther Duflo and Pascaline Dupont and Samuel Sinet, we were looking at this HIV/AIDS project I mentioned earlier. One of the treatments was providing education about AIDS. Another approach was just paying for school uniforms, which allowed people to stay in school longer. Now, these two treatments, potentially they could interact with each other. If you're looking at an outcome like HIV/AIDS, you need a huge sample because it's a very rare outcome. Even if we were looking at pregnancy, but even with pregnancy, it's a rare enough outcome, and we weren't that optimistic about these treatments having a big effect that you still are going to need a very big sample. This becomes very expensive to do. If you take that sample and you divide it into 4 cells, one of which gets so that half the sample, so say a quarter of the sample gets both free uniforms and education. A quarter of the sample gets but no education. Education but no free uniforms. A quarter of the group gets neither. Then you're going to be able to you're going to be able to measure the impact of free uniforms conditional on half the sample having had the HIV/AIDS education, half the sample not having HIV/AIDS education. So you can measure the main effect, but you're going to be measuring a different local average treatment effect than you would be had you not done both programs. Is that a problem or is that not a problem? It depends whether the other elements of the program that you're looking at are elements that are that you think are going to have make this an uninteresting sample to look at. I'd argue in that case, this is it was worth it to try and look at more treatments. Okay. Another advantage of this is that you can explicitly look for interactions, but I'm making the argument that the main reason for this is cost savings. So I'm going to presume that we're not doubling the sample when we're looking at 2 things. So your power on those interactions may not be that great. I think in general, the way that economists do this, you typically don't have a lot of power on the interactions. Obviously, you could choose a big enough sample so that you have and explicitly go after the interactions. By the way, I'm happy to, happy to have comments or discussion in between. I don't know if this is something that in a medical audience would be very controversial. They really don't like this. I think part of the reason they don't like this is they're worried that, that in practice things are going to get confused and you're not going to get the treatments being implemented the way they were supposed to. You know, another advantage of doing cross-cutting treatments is sometimes the design is such that it very naturally allows you to get it at a variety of effects. So we did another class size experiment where, so Kenya moved to free primary education. When they moved to free primary education, there was a huge surge in enrollment, particularly in the lower grades. So you got a situation in which class size in first grade was, averaged, 80 or more. Okay? So in that setting, we looked at a class size reduction program in which schools were given money to hire an extra teacher. In that setting, you can argue that it's quite useful. So class size, even in poor countries in first grade, is typically not 80. Okay? So if you're interested in some other questions, suppose you're interested in the question of what's the effect of grouping children by their initial achievement? Okay? Arguably, had we done a study on what's the effect of grouping kids by their initial achievement in a setting where class size was 80, and we hadn't done this class size reduction program, we would actually be estimating the treatment effect in a very strange population, in a population where the class size was 80. By reducing the class size to 40, then looking at the effect of grouping kids by initial achievement is actually arguably a more interesting question, because that setting is probably more similar, more similar to the context of children in normal times and in other countries. There's also a logistical gain from this, because once you've added a second teacher, it's very easy to think about how do you assign kids to classes. One approach would be we assign them randomly so that each teacher has the whole mix of initial achievement. The other is you break the class in two by the initial test scores. So in that particular setting, we were able to look at multiple things in one setting, and I would argue without a loss of external validity. Okay, so these are I've sort of gone through a bunch of methods of how you can design the randomization. Okay? Let me turn to another topic of how do you convince the partner and others to try an experiment. So one thing I think is quite important in this social experiment context, which is you really need to make sure your partner is committed before you invest a lot of resources in this. Right? There's a lot of times that people will, I've argued partners, there's a lot more willingness to do this than we thought 20 years ago. But at the same time, these are not easy, these do put demands on the partner. And the challenge, let me mention, is not necessarily randomization. That may not be the problem for the partner. The problem for the partner may be something that's much more simpler and logistical. You as a researcher may want to do a baseline first, and you may need time to do that baseline. Or you may need time to get your human subject approvals. The partner organizations say, no, we have to roll this out right away. We've got the end of our fiscal year is coming up, and we have to spend the money by the end of the fiscal year. Those sorts of issues can be just as important. Now, usually you can work out those issues, I've found. But it takes some creativity to find a win-win solution, to slip into that speak. But you have to have a partner who's willing to put in the effort, to both sometimes to give something up, and more often just to put in some effort to think about how can we work this out so they can meet their needs and the research can also be addressed. And they also have to be capable of implementing the intervention. So there's some NGOs that are just too weak in their capacity to actually implement the intervention as planned. So given how much effort these are, what I stressed in the talk this morning, you probably don't want to put in a lot of effort unless in a situation where you're going to be hostage to a partner who isn't committed. You also have to think about what is not just the individual so to come back to an anecdote from my personal experience, we worked with an NGO for many years in Kenya. The head of their head of their Africa programs was very committed to this, and but it was a Dutch organization. They eventually got a new head in the Netherlands who was not who was not committed to this, and the relationship with that NGO fell apart. It was pretty, we were able to rescue things, but it was quite took a lot of time. So it's worth thinking not just about the individual you're dealing with, but about, to the extent you can, thinking about the organization more broadly. In talking to potential partners, so this question came up at the end of John's talk, how do you find organizations that are willing to do this? Well, you have to learn to speak their language, hence my win-win statement. See, I'm learning to do this. So you have to learn to talk their language. You also need to realize that while we're going to be most interested, if this is a policy thing, does their program work? That may not be the question of most interest to them. If you go to a microfinance organization, if you think about it, there's now been a lot of research on microfinance. And it's only now, after many, really after many attempts to do this, that we're finally getting some results on, is microfinance raising incomes of the poor? It was much easier to get studies on let's vary the way we do microfinance. Because people in an organization, they may be pretty committed, they may already be pretty convinced of the basic mission of their organization. But at the same time, they may be very open-minded about some details. Should we have group liability or should we have individual liability? Should we have our repayments once a week or once a month? So those issues may be very important to organizations. So when they're establishing a relationship with the organization, it may make sense to go in with those. I wouldn't go in with those if you don't think those are academically interesting. But if you do think there's something academically interesting, that may be an easier entree to the organization than, is your organization a success or a failure? Other organizations would love data on whether they're a success or a failure. A lot depends on the individuals in the organization. Another thing that's useful is to feed data back throughout the process. So this is something that, as John mentioned, what's the trade-off? What's the deal? The deal is free consulting for the organization. And there are things where we can add value. And there are huge mounds of data that many organizations have, and they don't even know some basic statistics from them. So, and that may be more, I have no idea, maybe that's less of an issue in some business organizations, but certainly a lot of nonprofit organizations or governments are very much fit that mold. And it's also a source of potential new projects that may be of research interest. You don't want to spend too much time doing that, but I think there's some gains from trade there. Okay, so aside from the organization, you have to think about the community and other stakeholders. I wrote the comparison group will find out about the treatment. I guess that was before I saw John's talk and was thinking as well about it. Thinking in this mass mailing example, the comparison group might never, find out. But if you're thinking about building, about paying for extra teachers, the schools that are not the treatment schools and don't get the extra teachers, they're going to find out about this. The randomization, as I mentioned earlier, randomization is often seen as fair. So I think that's the best way to explain this is to say that, human subjects requirements will typically say that you have to say this is a research study, so I think that should be part of the explanation. But you can also say, which is typically true if you're working with nonprofit organizations, they have limited resources and they can't serve everybody at once. Okay. So this is sort of talked about. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Comparison or not. Do you have an opinion about that? Should you be up front, or is it better to sort of let just a little trickle out to them?
No, I think I think you basically have to be up front because you want to start collecting data early on. So you want to collect data. You might not need to do a baseline, but generally I think it's a good idea to do a baseline. One of the topics I'll talk about later is whether to do a baseline. So I think you typically want to do a baseline. If you're going to do a baseline, then you need to collect data from people. If you're collecting data from people, then human subjects requirements say that you've got to tell them what's going on. So I don't know whether that's ideal, but that's I'm not going to answer the meta question of are the human subjects requirements optimal. I'm working within that. I'm taking that as a constraint. But taking that as a constraint, you sort of have to tell everybody what's going on. I think that's. And again, maybe this is not. There may be settings where this is not an issue. The mailing out letters to people sounds like a great one, where you're going to rely on administrative data on contributions, and presumably that sort of thing can get through IRBs. But in the sort of setting where you're providing something to an institution, providing something of value, I think this approach. I also think practically it probably works better. So probably even unconstrained by human subjects, it's probably the right way to go. I don't think we haven't found it to be a huge problem. I mean, people are remarkably willing to accept this. Let me say one other thing that's slightly off topic, but so a lot of the work that I've done has been working with institutions like schools, or so it's a unit above the individual. So people often think in that case of fairness in terms of the units rather than in terms of the individual. So as long as the institution knows it's going to get something eventually, that helps. The other thing is that practically, it's hardest to get cooperation from the higher socioeconomic status people. So in the school case, the teachers, the kids are happy to be interviewed, and parents are happy to, you have to get hold of the parents to sign a consent. That can be a hassle. But the teachers are the ones who are going to be most reluctant, or the headmasters. Well, you can try and design. One of the things you have to think about when doing this work is, do you make payments or gifts to the respondents? And there's you may need to do that more for teachers and for headmasters than for, give a pen or a T-shirt or whatever it is as a gift, rather than more than with the lower level people who are within the institution, which in some ways is not very fair, because you're giving more to people who are already richer. But in terms of what you need to do to get cooperation, they have a higher price. Okay. So any other questions or comments on that? Okay. So what is the step in designing an intervention? So it's worth, this point about reinventing the wheel applies not just to questionnaires and surveys, but to interventions. So definitely you want to start out by doing a literature review, not just the academic papers, which we'd be familiar with, but also sort of in development it's called the gray literature about the project. So there's often internal reports or consulting reports on a particular project. So for example, I'm interested in a health insurance program in India right now. Well, the World Bank has reports on this, and their internal reports on the Indian government, et cetera. You can also do some qualitative field work. You can talk to individuals. It may also make sense to bring groups of people together in a focus group and talk to them in a group. You can talk to sort of community leaders, village leaders about this, or to NGOs and government officials, donors. You can try and develop an intervention, and then you've got to pilot that intervention. And piloting the intervention, there's much more that can, everything that can go wrong with a survey, even more can go wrong with an intervention. So piloting the intervention, I wrote is essential. I guess I should take that back a little bit. Lots of, we're economists, so nothing's essential. There's going to be trade-offs, and sometimes you're forced by, your partner has some timing. But if you don't pilot, if you have any choice, you should pilot. Unless, of course, you're looking at an existing program that's already been, it may be that the pilot's already been done, because it's a matter of taking an existing program and just expanding the coverage of it. Okay. It's very important so getting the program implemented as it's supposed to be implemented is tricky. It's very easy to mess that up. So you really have to be very involved in that. Things that you would think would be quite easy turn out not to be. So developing a training program for the people who are involved, the enumerators, the implementers, is important. thinking about what's the nature of contracts that you have. I think that's one of the advantages either of working in close cooperation with an NGO over a period of time, so you have a sort of a long-term relationship, or doing it yourself as in a lab experiment or as in some of the more recent field experiments. It's important to assign different implementers. I guess there's a word missing there. Different implementers to different treatments. So if you have a training program, so on this, to come back to this hygiene and sanitation and water, if you've got, imagine you have some people who you're trying to look at the relative effectiveness of hand washing and latrine usage and water chlorination in fighting diarrhea. Well, you're going to train community workers to go talk to households and encourage them to do these things. You don't want to train some community worker and say, okay, you go tell those households to wash hands to prevent diarrhea and tell those households to chlorinate their water. Right? The person's going to, they're a human being. First of all, they might just get confused. But second, if they want to help out the people who they're talking to, they're going to tell them both things. Okay? So it's much better to say, in this community, we're going to do one thing, in that community, we're going to do another, and then you hold separate training sessions for the different implementers. On the other hand, you want the data collection to be as similar as possible across treatments. So the people who are doing the surveys to find out was there diarrhea, you don't want to assign one set of hold separate, have separate enumerators for separate treatments. Okay, one thing, so when Jim was here, he mentioned there's a lot of, recent graduates who are from undergrads who are going out there and grad students. So if you have those people involved, it's important to talk to them about what issues are going to be sensitive. For example, politics or, drug use or for example. So there are things that it's maybe better not to talk about a lot. Certainly things it's better not to blog about how corrupt this country is and et cetera. It sounds sort of obvious, but it's worth explaining to people. And data confidentiality is another thing. Again, this is a human subject issue. You want to, they should, in any blogging, they are going to blog because that's what 24-year-olds do. But you have to, they probably should not be. They certainly should not be blogging about data points in the study that can be individually identified, and should generally not be blogging about corruption in the local government that they've seen. I wrote physical danger. So here this is something that I think a lot of these issues are things particularly for foreigners who are going to work there. The physical danger is something that applies to everybody, because I think the main source of physical danger is going to be road accidents. And whatever can be done, there are a lot of things that are more salient, but the real danger, I think, is traffic. There's malaria and HIV and all sorts of things, but traffic, I think, is the biggest risk. And motorcycles are really dangerous. So on the other hand, some places, I'm not, it may be that some places that's the only practical alternative, but there is a real cost to using this. Cars are really expensive to use to collect data. Okay, to come back to, so next issue is, should you do a baseline? Okay. So, the standard approach in economics papers is to have what people call Table 1, which shows that your, treatment group and comparison group are similar. Now, that's something that we need to do when you're doing natural experiments. You have to establish that. If you're doing a randomized experiment, it's at least worth considering whether you need to do a baseline and to show that. If I think this is something that's worth thinking about in the particular context. Are you confident of randomization without having a baseline? Okay? That may depend. If you have a list of all the donors to a particular organization and they tell you they're randomizing, well, then I think you better check it, because I don't trust a large liberal organization to use the data random number generator correctly. or Excel random number generator. If I probably do trust John to do it correctly, however. So, whether you do a baseline might depend on who exactly is, in this particular circumstance, do you trust the randomization? By the way, there are many times, where people will tell you things are random where they're not. Here, they'll describe the procedure incorrectly. So it was involved in a study on college roommates. What's the effect of having a college roommate who drinks on your GPA? It's pretty negative if you're male. What's the effect of having an African-American roommate if you're white on your racial attitudes? And in doing this study, we did checks between characteristics that should have been predetermined. It took us a long time. We were not passing those checks for a long time. Turns out that the university thought they had, first of all, there were many universities said it was random, by which random they meant we matched up the roommates. That's not random. But then even among the ones that, the university we worked with did use a computer, but the algorithm, they didn't understand their own algorithm very well. And it turned out that there were aspects of their algorithm that were causing these randomization checks not to pass until we conditioned on all the things that went into that algorithm. And then conditioned on that, it was random. But I think this is, the general point is, the exact randomization procedures is quite important. Okay, so come back to this issue of do you do a baseline? If you're not confident of randomization, that's one reason to do a baseline, to check if you think your readers might not be confident of randomization. But a baseline's pretty expensive. If you don't do a baseline, if each visit costs a certain amount, if you don't do that baseline, you could double your sample size. And a lot of doing this stuff comes down to resource trade-offs. So that might be an argument for not doing a baseline. Why do I think it makes sense to have a baseline typically? Well, it allows controls for the baseline characteristics, in particular the lagged value of the outcome of interest. Putting that in will typically soak up a lot of variance. So if this is a persistent outcome, like test scores or GPA, then it's almost certainly worth doing that baseline, unless you can get that information from administrative data, in which case you don't need to do a full baseline, and then that can serve as a randomization check. You can also look at interaction effects with other characteristics, and in some cases those may be important. Other covariates typically don't soak up that much variation. The key thing is the baseline value of the outcome variable. Interactions, some cases, if your research question says that the interaction is important, you better do that baseline. But that's going to depend on the setting. Wherever you can do this with administrative data, you certainly should. The money's to, if the administrative data is rich enough that you have the baseline value of the outcome variable, I would put your money use your money elsewhere. Okay. What to measure when you're doing the randomized evaluation? So if you want to go, and I think increasingly, I think that's something we should have been doing all along, and increasingly will be demanded and should be. If you want to do welfare analysis, there are some questions where in some cases you're answering a theory question where welfare is beside the point, so maybe not always. But in many policy cases, you want to do some welfare measurement. You don't just want to say height went up by 1 centimeter among the people who got this extra prenatal care. You want to say, is it worth it? So a randomized, if you think of test scores, for example, let me give an education example. Test scores are a function of a whole bunch of characteristics. How much effort the child puts in, how much effort the teacher puts in, how the teacher teaches, parental inputs of various types, and let's say class size. Okay? Well, if you have a program that changes class size, and you look at the outcome, and you say, okay, we reduced class size by hiring another teacher, test scores went up by 0.1 standard deviations. Well, to evaluate the welfare impact of that, you have to take into account that the other inputs, most models of production would say if you adjust one input, exogenously, other inputs are going to adjust as well. So if that's the case, or at least they potentially could adjust. So if that's the case, then you have to think about what's the value of the other inputs that were either crowded in or crowded out. And maybe this is even more complicated. Maybe you're producing multiple things. You're not just producing test scores. You're producing other things. So the standard welfare analysis would say there's two legitimate ways to look at welfare. One is to say we're measuring the partial derivative of test scores with respect to class size. But you're typically not going to be measuring, you're typically not going to get that with a randomized evaluation. In a non-experimental setting, you may, I'm not sure you would get it in a non-experimental setting either, but you're probably not going to get it in a randomized evaluation. So then what you have to do is you have to try and make some stab at valuing the other inputs and potentially the other outputs that are coming out of this. Okay. So there are a number of examples like this. So there's work in Colombia, India, Zambia, suggesting that when school inputs go up, household inputs may go down. If the school's providing textbooks, the parents aren't going to buy the same textbook for their kid. In John's presentation, there was a discussion of could teachers respond to a program that's creating incentives for kids. So work we did in Kenya, we looked at a program that had merit scholarships for kids, in some ways quite similar, rewards for kids based on their test scores. And what we found, interestingly, was that led teachers to show up more. And we're not sure what the mechanism was. It might have been that the teachers were concerned about their pupils and they wanted to help their pupils. Maybe the parents put more pressure on the teachers to show up. But that, it's an example that suggests that sometimes changing one input exogenously will change others. In Colombia, we found that when you gave vouchers to kids for private school, they spent less time working. I'll skip the water example. So the general lesson is here. When you think about what to measure, think about other inputs. If you're trying to do welfare analysis, think about other inputs that could change in other outputs. Actually, let me explain this travel time because that's a slightly different point. I'll discuss this paper more later, but work we've done with Ted Miguel and Jessica Leno and Alex Swane looks at what's the effect of improving water sources. And we were initially interested in what's the health impact of this. But we observed that when you improved a water source, people who had used other water sources switched and started coming to these sources. So you can see what the extra willingness of people is to walk to get the improved water source. Turns out that can actually be a measure of how much people value this. So it's actually conceptually quite different than the rest of the slide. That probably should have been a separate bullet point. Another way to get at the welfare impact is forget about sort of valuing the output and valuing the input. Say we're going to use a revealed preference approach and see how much more willing people are to pay for this or pay by walking. Okay. So you've got some hypotheses. You've got some things you want to measure. There may be cases in which you want to take multiple measurements on the same individual. So you may want to do that just to increase precision. I mentioned the difficulty of getting anthropometric measurements. You may just want to say, we're going to weigh people and take their height at the beginning of the interview, and we're going to do that again at the end of the interview, and we're going to take the average. Okay? Another thing you can think about is you may be asking, so in our project on what's the impact of going on Hajj, we were interested in what's the impact on religiosity, and what's the impact on local religious belief as opposed to sort of worldwide consensus Islamic belief. What's the impact on sort of local Pakistani practices? Because this is an issue of scholars of religion debate about there's a view that sort of local customs are being displaced in favor of, some people argue in favor of sort of a Saudi version of Islam. There's various different versions of this. So in that case, a single question might not be a very good measure. We can ask, do you visit a local shrine? But maybe that's not going to, which is not something that Saudis would like very much, but this might be part of a local Pakistani religious practice. A single question might not measure what you're after that well. So you can ask a whole bunch of questions. If you're thinking about something like the Hajj, there's a lot of potential outcomes that you're interested in. What's the impact on views of women? What's the impact on views of non-Muslims. So there we had an immense questionnaire. What you may, because you're going to have a lot of different outcomes, there's a lot of scope for data mining in there. So what you would ideally do is you'd lay out a plan ahead of time for what questions you're going to group together. So there's a technique called average effect size. I may talk more about it later depending on time, which can be used to sort of extract sort of try and make things reduce, going from hundreds of questions, say, we're going to group these 15 questions together as a measure of X, and you can note that ahead of time. By the way, if you want to register, data mining is a general, I think the best thing about randomized evaluations, so in theory, the best thing about randomized evaluations is that they make the treatment group and the comparison group comparable in expectation and help deal with omitted variable bias. That's great. But I think practically the best thing about randomized evaluations is they reduce the scope for discretion for the researcher. They don't eliminate it, but they reduce the scope for discretion for the researcher to choose among 300 different specifications to choose the one that works best for the hypothesis, that gives them a t-statistic above 2. So reduces it from 300 options down to 10. If you want to be tough, you can register you can say ahead of time what specifications you're going to run and register that. You can do that at Poverty Action Lab, perhaps at other places. Okay? Whether we're up to the standard that this is what you would do in a medical trial. There's all sorts of ways in which the people who do medical trials are tougher than we are. Are we ready to sign up to everything that they do? Maybe we should be. Probably not quite there. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. So let me draw a distinction between two different things. One is, so once you've got your treatment group and your comparison group, and you've decided which is which, you've started your program, and then if somebody from your treatment group, you have some school where you've reduced class size, and then somebody from that school, and then somebody from the comparison group moves over and goes into the treatment group school. They think, hey, I want a small class size too. I'm switching schools. Well, so one thing I haven't talked about, that's a topic I haven't addressed because I'm sort of presuming that we all know what to do in that case, and it's unambiguous. They're still part of the group they were originally assigned to. So when you should analyze this using the original assignment and either do intention to treat or do an IV where you do the initial randomization as an IV for your ultimate assignment. So that's, I think, quite crystal clear, and the profession general, in economics, we accept that. By the way, that's probably an example where I would say we're closer, we understand things better than the medical profession. I think they would sort of get totally freaked out about that and not, maybe that's not fair, but they might not know what to do about that case. The second issue is that the issue that you were asking about, or was it a different issue? Okay. So. Sure. So let me say what's so I would say readjusting the samples so I'll come to something later on which might be what you're talking about, which is I think is a mistake, but not a terrible mistake. But readjusting the samples, if I understand what you're saying, that's like not a temptation. That's like I would say that is sort of beyond the pale. The temptations that and obviously, that could happen, and nothing to, I don't know what we do about that. But I think what's more common would be, relatively honest mistakes of not mistakes. I'm not even sure they're mistakes. You haven't specified whether you're going to control what covariates you're going to control for. So you haven't specified in advance whether you have a program that's looking at reduction in class size. You haven't specified in advance whether you are going to group all the kids together, or you're going to control for sex of the kid, or you're going to separately report results for males and females. So there you've got a choice of several different specifications. Now, in a randomized evaluation, typically it's not going to make much difference which one of those you do. If it's a large sample, you're going to have pretty good balance of male and female between treatment and comparison group. But there are other cases in which you can make a legitimate argument either way, and the fact that you can make a legitimate argument either way opens up some scope for researchers to affect the answers. So that I think that problem is greatly reduced in randomized evaluations relative to non-experimental work, but it's not completely eliminated. I think there are things we could do to further reduce it, and I'm going to talk about some of them here in this talk. Why don't I go on for a bit, and then I'm happy to revisit this. Okay. So another issue is, so we talked about what to measure. Another question is when to measure it. So in many cases, the effect of a program is going to change over time. That's very clear in educational interventions. Sometimes you get big effects, and then they fade out over time. There's other dynamics you can get. Here's a bunch of examples where that's happened. It often will make sense to measure, because effects can change over time. If you have the budget, it's nice to measure at multiple points. What's the short-run effect, medium effect, longer-run effect? Now, money, as I've mentioned a number of times, is really pretty, it's a big ingredient in this work. Getting results at one stage can help in getting funding for more work. In particular, if you're showing an effect, if this is a policy thing, if you show an effect at one stage, you're more likely to get funds for sort of a later-run follow-up, which might be, and we should think about what's socially optimal. So there's an argument from a practical point of view, it may make sense to collect some data early on, and then even if you don't have funds to do it later on, and hope that you'll get additional funds to do that later. Okay. When you are collecting data, at each stage, collect information about phone numbers and names of people who might know where you are 2 years from now, to make it easier to find the respondents later. Okay. So an important issue is what unit to randomize at. And if you can get individual randomization, you're going to have a lot more power. Particularly if there's high, that should be intra-cluster correlation. But it may be difficult to have unequal treatment within a community. And there's some things where you just can't do it. If you're, well, for example, it might be hard to give out treats to some kids in a school, but not others, right? And there's some things like extra teachers, lower class size, you can't really, well, maybe you could vary that at an individual level. I think you actually could. So it's worth thinking about it, because I was originally thinking you couldn't. There are other cases where there's spillovers, where the intervention, you're interested in the general equilibrium effect at some level. So in treatment of kids for worms, there'll be a disease externality. In these cases, you may want to do multiple levels of randomization. So you can randomize across larger units, like schools, which ones get treated or with high intensity, which ones with low intensity, and then within each unit, you could randomize the intensity of treatment. And then you might be able to separately identify sort of the individual effect and the spillover effect. Okay. And then you may also be able to vary encouragement. Okay, another question is, what's the form of randomization? So we talked about the baseline already. Should you do the randomization in public or in private? So you could imagine a very public ceremony where you draw balls out of a hat, or that might be useful for transparency in some cases. In general, I'd lean towards using a random number generator. One question is, do you do this real time, or do you do it ex ante? Okay. So there's evidence to think that if you're doing this real time, you may have real problems of people sticking to the protocol. So this is work that Rebecca Thornton was involved in. And so in the early stages of her work, this involved nurses had to hand out vouchers to people. And the vouchers could be for different amounts. They could be for 0 or up to 200. And she looked at if you look at the blue, that's what should have been the distribution of voucher amounts. The actual distribution of voucher amounts was given by the red. Okay, the nurses were supposed to randomize on the spot. I think it was nurses, and the enumerators in any case. They didn't like giving nothing to people, and they liked giving a lot to people. I think that's quite general. In general, that's what, there's a lot, I'm sure there's a lot of corruption in the world, but when you're talking to somebody face to face, you want to help them out. So I think that's a general issue to be concerned about. Okay, now what you can do, if you need to start treating some people right away because of time pressures, you can do waves. So you can say, well, we can't wait to do our baseline on everybody. We need to randomize and start treating some people. But you could say, well, we're going to we have 1,000 people in this study. We're first going to do a baseline on 100, and then we're going to randomize those, and then we're going to do a baseline another 100, and then randomize those. Okay? That's, you won't probably get quite as good balance with that between treatment and comparison, but you'll be able to maybe meet your implementation constraints. But you should always do the baseline prior to the randomization. Okay? Otherwise, the people doing the baseline, either the respondents may answer differently knowing which group they're in, and the enumerators might ask questions differently knowing which group people are in. Okay, so I don't know whether this was also a question that you were getting at, but there's different forms of randomization. So Brun and McKenzie have a nice article on how do you get balance. And what are different ways to do it? So you could do your random. I think this is what you were calling block randomization. So you could have a pure random draw, or you could do stratification. So if you have stratification, you say, well, we want to get equal numbers of males and females in the treatment and comparison group. So I'm going to randomize separately among the males and separately among the females. So you could do that just for the outcomes strongly related to the outcome of interest. You could, for example, if it's test scores, you could stratify by initial test score. You could do that because you're interested in subgroup analysis. If you try and do it on too many different variables, you'll wind up with some empty cells. Right? If you say, well, I want to do it on sex and initial test score and height and eye color and everything else. So in that case, one thing you can do is you could have a procedure where you sort of say, how similar are people? And you put everybody in a pair, and then you assign one member of each pair to be treatment and one comparison. And you can minimize this distance function between people. Okay. An advantage of putting things in pairs like that, and I don't know whether this is, you can say if one of the member of that unit drops out, then you drop the whole unit. Okay, so if you have a, and then the resulting data set will stay balanced. Okay. Now, a final thing you can do is you can re-randomize. So what you can do is you can say, well, we're going to do a random draw. We'll then check and see if any of the covariates differ between treatment and comparison group. If they do, we'll do another random draw, and we'll continue until we get an acceptable sample. Okay? So one of the things this article shows, and Hito Imbens has done work on this, that makes the correct standard errors difficult to compute. Okay, so basically, you shouldn't do this re-randomization based on balance. Okay? If you've done it, it's not the end of the world. There are things you can do to fix it up, but it's not the best way to do things. Yes?
I think that people don't typically adjust their standard even for normal stratification.
Yeah. So that's another point of this article. This is a nice paper. I recommend it for people who are working in this area. So you're right. A lot of people, so one of the things this paper does is it talks about what do people do in practice. So people often don't say exactly what they're doing, but you're right. People often don't adjust their standard errors to take into account the way they stratified. Usually that is going to be conservative. They're going to report standard errors that are bigger than their true standard errors will be, but not always. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So they then simulate this. They take some actual data sets and they try different, they look at what the impact would have been of these different procedures. So, the first thing is that, matching, stratifying, controlling for the variables used in re-randomization, all those things increase power, okay? So you should, I'm sorry. Let me move down to this next bullet point. Pairwise matching performs best in general. So provided that the variables used for matching are good predictors of future outcomes. If you're matching on pure noise variables, if you're stratifying based on pure noise, that doesn't help. But in general, you probably want to stratify, you should stratify, and you should stratify a lot. Now this is, with samples up to, once you're up a sample is above 300, it doesn't really make that much difference. I don't think, because you're going to naturally get a lot of balance anyway. Okay, so you don't need to worry about it. But in a lot of development examples, if you're doing, or a lot of examples where you have to cluster for some reason, you're going to have pretty small samples. And in that case, you should stratify. And, why not take it to the max and go all the way to these pairs? Okay. So this is the statement. On average, it's overly conservative to not include the controls for stratum or pairs, to answer your question, Ryan. But not always, okay? I think this is a good point, that, you may be tempted to try the analysis with and without the stratum dummies. I think that, their recommendation, so this comes back to the question of researcher discretion. So to some extent, this is a matter of, we basically need to establish certain conventions as a profession. And I think that what they recommend, and what I personally would agree with, is you should control for all your strata. So, I think some people would, an alternative would say, no, don't add in controls. But I would say because you have too much freedom about what controls to include. But if you control for the initial value of the baseline of the outcome variable, and you control for all the strata you use to randomize, the strata you use to randomize, you had to set in advance. So there's not a lot of discretion there. So I would argue for that as a norm. Mm-hmm.
Like if you stratify variables that don't affect the outcome, and then if you have to include dummy variables for those strata,
Yeah.
that's going to reduce your power.
Yeah. So I would, but I don't think it's fair to. You won't have correct standard errors if you haven't taken into account that that's what you did. When ex ante, when you're thinking about what to include, if you're really in a situation where you have no idea what's going to affect the outcome other than your treatment, then you shouldn't make up stuff and stratify on it. But if you have reason to think things are important, you should stratify on it. You don't get hurt that much by that, typically. So there are recommendations. You should definitely talk about the details of how you randomized. You should control for the method of randomization. You should, I wrote here, rethink re-randomization, but basically that's not good. If you did do it, there's various things you can do to do it. It's not that big a deal. It doesn't, but it's clearly not optimal. Okay, and clearly you should stratify on the baseline outcome variable. That gets you a lot of extra power. They suggest also doing geographic regions. Okay. So what other things on size and power? So one question is, how much power do you need when you're doing your study? So this is an area where I think the official ideology of randomized trials is just, disconnected from the reality and disconnected probably from what should be the case. So the official ideology is you think about what size effect you are likely to pick, what the effect size is likely to be from your new anti-cancer drug, and then you figure out what power you need, how many observations you need, and if you can, and you write your grant proposal for that much money, and if they give it to you, you do your study, and if they come back to you and say, no, you have 20% less, we can only give you 20% less money than that, then you know your study is underpowered and you don't do the study. Okay? So first, I think that's unrealistic because you don't always get as much money as you want, and should you do the study if you have 20% less budget than you needed for 80% power? Probably yes, because by that time you've already done a third of the work of doing the study and getting to the stage where you could submit your grant proposal. Okay? Now, the reason is different ways to look at this. You can look at this from the individual researcher incentive standpoint, and there's some logic to this advice from the standard advice from the individual researcher, because the payoffs to the individual researcher, unfortunately, are very high for getting a t-statistic above 2 and much lower for a t-statistic below 2. If you look at this from the standpoint of the social planner, this is totally backwards. Okay? If you're trying to, we get the most information as a society, not from we get more information from the first 500 observations than we do from the next 500 observations. If we're thinking about, we're trying to estimate a parameter, what's the effect of this, of class size on test scores? Well, our first 500 schools that we randomize are going to tell us this effect is, with 95% confidence between, 0.05 and 0.15 standard deviations. That's, maybe more important than narrowing it down precisely to whether it's, and there's nothing special about a T of 2 for the social planner. And in fact, the social planner says, look, this researcher is doing one study, but there's some other researchers doing other studies, plus I've got some priors, and this is informing my posterior. So this is not at all what a social planner would do. Now, it is possible this is what a constrained social planner would do. If a social planner is constrained that people are going to be idiots, which I guess they generally are, and assume that any coefficient which is not significantly different from 0 is equal to 0. So if the social planner is constrained to say that all people reading the study are going to have that reaction, maybe it's not a good idea to do the underpowered study because people will make false inferences out of it. But hopefully, as time goes by, we can learn to be more sophisticated than that. I feel like this is actually an area where a lot more research and thinking is needed. About what is the appropriate, what's the socially the individually optimal is, that's, first let's think about what's socially optimal, and then maybe we could figure out what's individually optimal and sort of do strategic versions of this. But, here's some things. So, the general question of what power and size you need, I think that's, that's an open question. There's one, sorry, let me say one other reason why the advice manuals might be right. There's a huge ingredient in the cost of doing a study, which is not typically budgeted, which is the researcher time. So if you think there's a huge fixed cost of researcher time, then that somewhat goes against my argument earlier that there's a declining marginal value of additional observations rather than some magical threshold where the study is worth doing and not. So, it's probably, if you're only going to be able to have 4 data points, don't do the study because your own time is too valuable. Okay. So, suppose you want to do a power calculation. Okay, you have to think about the significance level. That's typically going to be 5%. What's the variance of the outcome? To do that, for some cases, you just care about a standardized effect size. You're doing everything in terms of standard deviations. If that's the case, then you don't care about the variance. But if you're interested in what's the cost-benefit ratio of the intervention, maybe you do need to get that. You could get, ideally you have some pre-data, but if you don't have some pre-data, you can look up some data from somebody else's study in a similar population. What's the how much variation in test scores is there, or in wages, or consumption. What's the effect size that you want to detect? So here's another place where I disagree with the advice manuals. The advice manuals sort of say, well, what does theory say the effect is going to be? And then let's size this so that we can size the study so we can pick up an effect of that magnitude. That's a little bit weird in that if we knew how big the effect was going to be, why are we doing the study? My inclination would be to say, what's the smallest effect that you want to detect? And that could be determined by cost-benefit calculations. So, an implication of that is, say you're looking at a health intervention, you want to look at, if you're looking at a cheap intervention, it doesn't apply to just health. If you're looking at cheap intervention, you may want the social planner is going to want a much larger sample than if it's an expensive intervention. If it's an expensive intervention, unless it has a huge effect on the outcome, you don't want to do it. It's not worth the money. If it's a cheap intervention, you may need a huge one. I think this is an area where the literature really gets it. Our existing institutions get this wildly wrong. What happens is people do a small sample on a cheap intervention. They don't get a statistically significant effect. The literature decides it's an effect of 0, and it doesn't get implemented. I think that's a problem in health research, certainly. Okay. Okay. What I've said is, is I think more right than what's before, but it's actually much more complicated. It may be that you from a Bayesian decision theory point of view, all you care about is should you implement this or should you not, and you just want to get over that threshold, and therefore you get also more complicated nonlinearities in this. Okay, for a test of theory, maybe you just want to distinguish a parameter from 0. Okay. Okay. What are important determinants of sample size? Clustering has come up before. I'm going to say a little bit more about that, but I'll be brief. I'm going to skip over these formulas. Let me just show clustering really means you need a lot bigger. In many cases, you'll need a much, much bigger sample. Okay, 5 times. You can only detect an effect 5 times bigger. Okay, this is showing the same thing. Intra-cluster correlation can be huge. Okay, much higher than some of the examples John gave, which just means you basically need to start thinking about your data point being in this sort of situation, your data point's the number of schools you have, not the number of kids. Getting more kids isn't going to help. Okay? So then if your intervention costs vary with the number of kids, maybe you want to work in small schools. So, obviously then there's questions of how much you can generalize from that. Okay. If you're going for hypotheses that are somewhat exotic, it's going to be harder and harder. Okay, so if you're just trying to get the difference between the treatment and the comparison, that may be easy enough. If you have 2 treatments, and you're trying to pick up the difference between the 2 treatments, is sanitation more important or water treatment more important? You're going to need a really big sample. If you're trying to pick up nonlinearities, that's really tough to do. If you put $10 more into schooling, $20 more in schooling, is it a linear effect? Well, you've got standard error bounds around around the 10 and the 20. Rejecting linearity is going to be tough. Okay, if you've got partial compliance, that's a real killer for power as well. If only half the people take it up, you're going to need 4 times the sample size. Okay. I'm going to speed up a little bit because it's late. If you've got families of outcomes, if you're testing a lot of different hypotheses, the odds are something's going to turn up right. Now, the most conservative approach to that is to say, well, if I'm testing 10 hypotheses, they don't have to be significant at the 5% level, but at the 0.5% level. That's probably too tough. There's a number of reasons why that's too tough. There's some other approaches that are going to be less strict than that. One reason why that's too tough is if you started out interested in a particular outcome, the correct inference for that outcome is still the 5% significance level. If your question is, did this treatment have any effect at all, then you do want to be tougher, but that might be, you don't have to be quite that tough. Okay. there are many cases. Imagine you have a very small sample. Okay, say you have 6 schools, or 20 schools, standard even 50 states. Clustering it doesn't work very well with small samples. A lot of the theory on that is asymptotic. How do you do things? Well, you can use something called randomization inference, which is basically you go through and you construct what are all the possible assignments that you could have had of treatment and comparison. And that gives you exact standard errors. Okay? So you can also do that if you re-randomized. If you have some complicated randomization procedure, for example, you re-randomized until you got on each of 10 covariates, you got a t-statistic of less than 1. That's not what you should have done, but if you did that, you can use randomization inference. You just draw 1,000 possible assignments of treatment and comparison. You can do this ex post. Those are placebo assignments. You see, do any of the, what distribution of coefficients would you have got out of that? Are your coefficients in the 5% tail? If so, then you can be confident that that your treatment had an effect at 5% significance level. Okay, Rosenbaum's a good is a good source of theory on that. Okay. Okay. Another issue of analyzing the data ex post is you'll often get behavioral responses that you maybe didn't think about before. How do you deal with that? Well, one way to deal with that is to model that and to use some theory to do that and put some structure on. And then that may allow you to understand what would have happened in it, or to, with some assumptions, what would have happened in other contexts. And I think in some ways, one of the directions the literature can move is to sort of combine randomized evaluation and structural methods. And that can take several forms. So you may test a structural model. I've cited some papers that do that. And then you can once you've validated the model, you can make some out-of-sample predictions. Another thing you can do is use a randomized evaluation to make inferences about a model parameter. So I mentioned this project earlier in which there was improvements to water sources called spring protection. We looked at whether people traveled further to go to these water sources. So then you can get, if you're willing to make some assumptions that are required for travel cost analysis, you can make some estimates of the valuation of different consumers for this. And then you can simulate the impact of different property rights schemes in water that would have led to, you could say, well, if this is how much people value spring protection, if you're able, right in this particular environment, you can't charge for water, and therefore you don't invest in improving the water source. Suppose you could charge, what would be the equilibrium of a game in which landowners were competing against each other and had to decide whether to make these investments? Okay. Now, in that type of setting, the way we decided to lay out this paper, and I think might be useful in other contexts as well, is to think about, to separate it by what conclusions can we draw without a lot of additional assumptions. For example, this is what the effect of protecting the water source was on the bacterial contamination in at the spring, at the household. That's relatively assumption-free. Still some assumptions. Let's move on to what you need more assumptions to buy. Say the travel cost model. With that, we can get consumer valuations for spring protection. If you assume people know about the impact of the spring protection on health, you can get valuation of health. If you're willing to make further assumptions and say that these guys are competing against each other and they're playing a Nash game and they're moving simultaneously, and we're willing to apply sort of BLP assumptions, then you can get, well, what would be the effect of different property rights assumptions? So whether or not you lay out the paper that way, in combining randomized evaluations and structural approaches, it's probably worth being clear about what assumptions you need for what results. Okay. So what steps forward? I think one is what I was just discussing, using the results of randomized evaluations to test structural models or to estimate parameters in structural models that allow you to make out-of-sample predictions. Think longer follow-ups. So there's a tendency in a lot of this work to follow up, once, relatively short run. But I think, we're starting to see that the results vary a lot over different time scales. Measuring intermediate outcomes to try and tell different effects apart. Trying to get at general equilibrium effects, which in some cases you can do by randomizing larger units. But in some cases, you'll need to put some structure on. And then finally, meta-analysis of the data. from randomized evaluations. There's been, some people have worried, there's a huge and quite vacuous debate about external validity of randomized trials. In some ways, this is going to be an empirical question that we have to answer, using the data. And, in many cases, we're now starting to have data to see, and, I think there's some, looks like a lot of things are generalizing quite well. There are other things that don't generalize as well, and there's some, it's early stages to say, but it looks like there's sensible reasons for what generalizes and what doesn't. That's going to be important for informing and trying to reach theoretical conclusions out of this wave of randomized evaluations. So let me just end by putting up some sources for more information. The JPAL course materials, that's really oriented towards practitioners. So, it spends a lot of time explaining some concepts that we would take for granted, but it's still very useful. And these slides draw on them. I mentioned this Bruno McKenzie article. Angus Deaton has a book on household surveys, which is very useful. There's this handbook chapter that Esther, Rachel, and I worked on, which covers some of this material. And there's another, Grosh and Gleve is another very useful reference on designing surveys. And there's a vast literature beyond that. But since it's 5:15, I think I'll